All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the Virtual Archaeology Conference. Before we get started today, I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are in the homeland of the Abenaki people. The Abenaki have been here since time immemorial and continue to be a thriving indigenous culture in this region. Lake Champlain Maritime Museum acknowledges with gratitude their generations of stewardship, past, present, and future. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to our fourth annual Virtual Archaeology Conference, and we're very excited that you could join us. My name is Sarah Yamaguchi, and I'm the Public Programs Manager here at the museum. Before we get started, I'd just like to briefly go over the structure of the webinar to make sure everyone is acquainted with the space. So, joining me behind the scenes is Michelle Fico, our Administrations Manager, who will be making sure that all of the tech goes smoothly and monitoring our chat. So if you have any technical questions that might come up during the webinar, feel free to use the chat to talk to myself or Michelle, and we'll try to help you out. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a button that says Q&A. You can use this to submit any questions you have that are related to the presentations being given tonight. At the end of every presentation, we'll take a few minutes to answer one or two questions quickly before moving on to the next presentation. But don't worry, any questions that we don't get to in between presentations, we'll save for our longer Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Today's webinar will consist of 4 presentations, and as I said, there'll be a longer Q&A session after them. So if your question doesn't get answered, worry not. If you have any problems accessing the chat or the Q&A, feel free to let myself or Michelle know, and we'll try to help you out. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our Executive Director at the museum, Chris Sabick, to get us started.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Welcome, everyone. Very excited to have you back for our 4th annual Virtual Archaeology Conference. We started this conference during the COVID situation, and it was such a great success that we've decided to continue it, and it's continued to grow in popularity and attendance, and we found it to be a very effective way to get information about our ongoing research and collections activities at the museum out to a much wider audience. And it's really nice to do it in the off season when everybody is available and not off doing their own field work or other activities. So thank you very much for joining us today. We have a nice variety of presentations today covering a lot of aspects of the archaeological program here at the Maritime Museum. One of our core values at the museum and something we're always striving to do is to increase access. And that comes in all forms. We're looking to increase physical access to our site. We're looking for increased access to our collections for researchers and the visiting public. We're looking for increasing access to the shipwrecks in Lake Champlain, and even providing access to or interpretation and access to the data that we've collected about the shipwrecks in Lake Champlain to our contract clients that we work with at the Maritime Museum as well. So that's kind of the overarching theme of what we're going to be talking about today in a number of different aspects. So just keep that in mind as we work through that. We're all about increasing access. There's no point in gathering all this data and information if you're not also going to share it with others. That's the whole point of this operation. So without further ado, I'll get going here with the presentations. But before we dive into that, I would just like to take this opportunity to encourage you to consider becoming a member of the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, particularly right at this moment in our history with the very significant uncertainty around federal funding streams, of which, the Maritime Museum is a recipient of a considerable amount of federal support that supports not only our archaeological programming, but also our educational program and our lake stewardship programs. It's vitally important that if you appreciate and respect what the Maritime Museum is working towards and working for, that you consider becoming a member or renewing your membership if you already are. My colleague Michelle is going to drop a link in the chat, which you can follow to our membership sign-in page. Your support means everything to us, particularly at this time, and we can't continue to do this great work without the support of our members. So thank you for considering that option at this time. So we're going to start right in with our first presentation by Sherilyn Gilligan, the co-director of the archaeology program here at the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum. And she's going to be talking about more than 40 years of experience with Vermont's Underwater Historic Preserve System. Take it away, Sharon.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in. Bear with me for a second while I get my presentation up here. Okay. I'm hoping that everyone can see this now. Whoop. All right. So thanks, Chris, for the intro. Thanks again for tuning in, everyone. So first, I'm going to explain how the dive preserves really began, which ties into a lot about how the museum actually began. So you're going to get a little bit of that history. And then I'm going to showcase some updates on some of the sites from the preserve system and share some of our latest research that we've produced from these sites. And I'll highlight what types of data we've produced from the preserve sites over the years, sort of sprinkled in along the way. One of the museum's long-term goals, as Chris mentioned, is to really get the word out to other researchers of all kinds that we have some really interesting and unique data sets here at the museum that are available for research. And so you'll hear a bit more about collections work happening later on in the conference as well that speaks more to our efforts in accessibility for some of these collections. So the Champlain Valley, we are located between Vermont and New York State, and we share the international border with Canada to the north, where the lake drains into the St. Lawrence Seaway. And the Champlain Valley has been an important resource to people since they first inhabited the region close to 13,000 years ago. And this region has remained important to people throughout human history, with the lake providing many necessary resources, as well as being a major transportation route throughout time. So with such a long history of human use, it's no surprise that the bottomlands of Lake Champlain contain many shipwreck sites, mostly dating to the historic commercial era. And the scientific investigation of these underwater shipwreck sites were really what started the Vermont Underwater Historic Preserves. And the image on the left here you can see is the Champlain Valley, and on the right is a close-up of the lake itself, and you can see some locations of the earlier wrecks that were added to the preserve system. In 1980, the Champlain Maritime Society was founded, and this organization was really the precursor for Lake Champlain Maritime Museum. The popularity of recreational diving in the lake was on the rise, and the organization was founded to enhance the maritime heritage of the Lake Champlain region through preservation, education, and research. And there was a foundational goal here of teaching the interested divers in Lake Champlain to be stewards of these archaeological sites and to help protect them and not damage or vandalize or loot these sites. And so the Champlain Maritime Society worked with the Vermont Division for Historic Preservation to help develop a management strategy for the historic shipwrecks in the Vermont waters of Lake Champlain, which of course falls under the purview of the state, with a few belonging to the U.S. Navy, which you may have heard more about from some of our past virtual archaeology conferences. But with the guidance of Vermont Division for Historical Preservation, the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum was founded a few years later as a nonprofit museum to help with that key element of educating the public about the human history of Lake Champlain, and to have a place to conserve recovered materials and to be that entity that could continue conducting archaeological research with these resources. So in 1996, the museum partnered with close to 20 groups, including foundations and government agencies, to conduct an underwater cultural resource survey using side-scan sonar technology in order to map as many archaeological sites or shipwreck sites in Lake Champlain as possible. And this project carried on through 2003. And so the museum also maintains this data set and is a main resource for all CRM projects that deal with Lake Champlain. So that's cultural resource management. Again, this is another topic you're going to hear more about later on in the conference. And so the museum is also involved with a lot of contract work like bridge replacements or power lines that need access to the bottomlands of the lake. So the museum's involved with CRM projects in Vermont and New York for our expertise in the regional history and the shipwreck data that we maintain. And I'll also note that Vermont State's GIS is finally being updated with all of our underwater sites, and that's in Lake Champlain and other state lakes. And so every state has a GIS system that maps their archaeological sites and other geographic state data. And this work began in the US in the 80s. And there's public and private data. So I encourage folks to check out your state GIS. There's some really interesting information on those websites. But anyway, for archaeologists, this means that we can use the state GIS to see and know where our known archaeological sites are so that they can be avoided for these CRM building projects. And it's generally a management tool, and we can add to that over time. And so this is on the right is our awesome staff archaeologist, Taylor Picard, who you'll hear from next. and they're going to talk more about GIS in particular soon. And they're spearheading this project, uploading our underwater sites to the GIS. And so they've been compiling all sorts of data sets that we have about our shipwrecks, starting with our sites in the preserve system. So marking what sites we have video documentation for, artifact collections, site plans, field notes, etc. And those are, because these are the ones that we really know the most about and we have the most data for, those in the preserve system. And so soon those are all going to be online on our state portal for CRM purposes, and we'll work them in batches with grant funding to get the rest uploaded as well. So again, this is just another example of work that we do with and for the state of Vermont, and occasionally New York State as well. Today, the museum, of course, remains steward for these wreck sites through support from Vermont Division for Historic Preservation. And when a new site is added to the preserve, we install a mooring and a buoy, which you can see a diagram for here on the right-hand side of the slide. And this keeps the wreck safe from anchors and allows easy access to divers. We also install leader lines to the wreck and signage for visiting divers to ask people to be respectful, to warn them that vandalism is punishable by law. And we visit these sites, the preserve sites, in a rotation. You can see some of our divers here rotating. We're also continually monitoring that infrastructure system and the state of preservation of the wrecks themselves. So we replace parts and lines as needed. We're also a Vermont State repository, so we have an MOU with the state to curate the artifact collections from the preserve sites and others at the museum, up to Department of Interior standards, of course. And we continue to conduct archaeological investigations at many of these sites, and we've added some new sites to the preserve recently. And so one of the things that we're beginning to work towards is developing photogrammetry models of all of our preserve sites, and then continuing to create these new models of the sites for comparison over time. And the museum also houses the earliest photo and video documentation of these wreck sites before zebra mussel infestation. So we have some really great comparative data. And we've recently sent our old Betamax and VHS tapes out to be digitized. So we're hoping to get that back soon to share some of that earliest footage that we have with the public. And here you can see a list of our 12 dive preserve sites. This is on the museum's website. There were 2 added in just the last year or so, and I'll touch on them in a few more minutes. But we also have a diver registration system that we use to try and track visitation to the sites each year. And this has changed over from a paper form. Our local dive shop in Burlington used to have these available for visitors, and anyone who was taking charters from the dive shop to visit the preserve sites would be asked to fill out this form as well. Well, now this has changed over to digital. And so we have a link on our museum website where folks can register from their phones or computers. The same link is also available on the Vermont Division for Historic Preservation website. And you can also check back and see which wrecks are open once we get their buoys installed for the year. And I think this past year was actually the first time we had no more paper registrants, which is kind of wild. We had a big stack of them over the years, and once they ran out, we were like, this is the transition into the digital age, right? And so it's been interesting to see. I think there's some people, that were really used to that paper system and maybe preferred it. So, we've been trying to figure out ways to incentivize people to register online. Registration is free, of course, as is access to the preserves, but to be able to better track visitation and create a system that more accurately reflects how many visitors we get really would help us out. And so even knowing something like individual dives to each wreck, right? Because when people go out, sometimes they'll do multiple dives on a single wreck. So we're really trying to figure out how the best way to sort of capture that data. Generally speaking, we know that there's more visitors than we're actually being able to track right now. But raising those numbers helps us in our ability to raise money to conduct more research and, of course, upkeep the sites and add more to our system over the years. And this is kind of a cool chart that shows registration for the preserves over the years. The earliest data that I could find for registrants was 1996, and we had a whopping 444 registrants that year. And you can see those numbers sort of settle down and even out to an average of about 150 per year. And again, we know that there are more folks visiting these sites than are actually registering. This has always been the case. So again, thinking about ways to make that easier, maybe make it more fun for people to register so we can get a better idea of those actual numbers. And maybe even figure out ways that the public can start to help us record changes to these sites over the years. Okay, now we'll look at some of our wrecks in the preserve. So the first site that Champlain Maritime Society began to investigate archaeologically was the steamboat Phoenix. And the historic preserves really started with the Phoenix project that began in 1980. So the vessel was measured, a plan drawing was created, and a few charred artifacts were recovered and conserved. And you can see that field crew's sweet album cover on the top right here of this slide. And then you can also see our colleague George Swartz and their crew on the bottom there. George is with the Naval History and Heritage Command, and he wrote his dissertation on Phoenix in 2012, I believe. And so these guys, this crew documented construction features, they created a full site plan, and produced digital reconstruction models of the vessel. Phoenix is actually the oldest extant steamboat example in the world that we know of. So this vessel is really of great interest to researchers worldwide. So this vessel had been ferrying passengers across the lake in 1819 when it caught fire. And this all happened at night, of course. Rescue boats were launched, but about a dozen people were actually left behind on the burning ship. And they were able to rescue some, but 6 people actually lost their lives because of this accident. A few months later, ice movement in the lake dragged the charred wreck off of Colchester Shoal, where it had eventually beached, and it sank into deeper water. So the charred hull of this wreck now rests at a fairly steep incline on the bottom of Lake Champlain. So the bow is around 60 feet deep, and the stern end is about 110 feet deep, which makes for a really interesting dive. It's almost like an optical illusion. You have to really watch your buoyancy exploring this wreck because of this real steep incline where it rests. Now, in the past 5 years, there's been some new research happening with this wreck. More specifically, both of the paddle wheels of this wreck were discovered in deep water, about 180 feet, by a longtime friend of the museum, Gary Lefebvre. So Gary is a dedicated and accomplished lake researcher who's willing to share data and ideas with us. So we love Gary. He's also been a longtime steward of cultural resources in Lake Champlain and elsewhere. So Gary was out investigating sonar targets with his remote operated vehicle, his ROV. And he took some footage of an interesting looking target and he sent it over to Chris Sabick at the museum. And they sort of put this together that, this looks like it could be a paddle wheel from a really early steamboat, very possibly from the nearby sunken Phoenix. And up until this point, it was generally accepted that the paddle wheels had been lost in the fire that destroyed this ship in 1819. So these paddle wheels, again, oldest known example from a steamboat that we know of anywhere in the world right now. So they're thinking, okay, so if this is one of the paddle wheels, I wonder if the second one is around this area too. And so they continued investigating, and sure enough, Gary located a second charred looking paddle wheel. And you can see that image here. This was found about 100 meters south of the first one. So this was all happening in 2020. Chris ended up reaching out to one of the museum's longtime partners at Texas A&M, Kevin Krisman, who was in that sweet 1980s album cover crew, as well as our colleague George Swartz, who again worked on this site from 2010 to 12. And they all reviewed this footage and came up with a plan to send some technical divers down to take measurements and capture more video footage of the wheel assembly so that more could be learned about the way these were built and mounted to these early style steamships. And you can see some of the imagery here. A portion of the drive shaft for the wheel is still attached to the flange or the hub of that wheel. So this new data really ties in with the research questions that George was asking about construction features of the vessel in his dissertation. So it's really cool to see this research continuing after, such a long history. And now, because of this amazing find, and after the permits were acquired, the bearing block from the assembly was actually recovered from the wreck site of Phoenix. And that's currently being conserved at the museum, should be finished sometime this year. So this is a still from the photogrammetry model of that block before any mechanical cleaning took place. So this is what it looked like, when it was first recovered. And here you can see some stills from the photogrammetry model after some preliminary scrubbing. So you can see it pretty cleaned up here. And there are links from the museum's website to our Sketchfab pages where you can see a bunch of our photogrammetry models too, if you want to check those out. And then here's probably the coolest album cover / field crew photo. So this was the field crew for exploring those paddle wheel sites and raising the bearing block. Chris Sabick grabbed this from the photo from the ROV footage, so you can see them sort of dealing with the remote control and putting in some lines there. Okay, so that's some cool new research that's been happening with one of the older preserve sites lately. But the past 2 field seasons, we've added 2 more wreck sites to the Vermont Underwater Historic Preserves. So there's now 12 wreck sites that divers can visit. And those 2 new sites are the Providence Island Canal Sloop and the Potash Point Canal Boat. So Providence Island Canal Sloop is a sailing canal boat. It's an 1862 class sailing canal boat. So that's 86 feet long, 14 feet wide. And these measurements were based on the sizing of the newest locks in the canal system at the time. This wreck sits at about 85 feet of water, so it's an advanced dive. This wreck was found and mapped back in 1996 during the first sonar survey of the Lake Champlain. And you can see the sonar image from that wreck here in this slide. Here you can see a photogrammetry model of this wreck that our friend Gary made in 23. And I'll read a little blurb from the 96 report that describes this wreck a little bit. And I'll also mention here that when they began the lake survey, they gave target letter denominations. So this one was called Wreck F. Wreck F is sitting upright and completely intact on the bottom and almost certainly sank in unplanned and extreme circumstances. All elements that made it a working watercraft are still present. The main mast lies in situ in the mast tabernacle. The wood and paint are in an excellent state of preservation. The boom is present with its leather-coated jaws. The anchor still hangs off the hawse pipe in the bow of the vessel, and the windlass is intact on the bow. The rear cabin of Wreck F still houses a wood stove, plates, dishes, cups, and water pitchers. Now, generally speaking, for a lot of the wrecks that entered the preserves on the earlier side, large projects were undertaken to recover material remains for later conservation and display, either at the museum or some went in traveling exhibits. For this wreck, materials were not recovered. This is a very deep site. We strongly discourage people from entering the unsafe cabin area, which could easily collapse. And we also try our best to remind the visiting public that removal of any objects from this site is illegal, but more importantly, it's detrimental to our collective understanding of this site and others. It's also possible in the future to further identify this wreck. So, by taking care of this site and others like it, is really important to our future research for some of these cultural resources. And here you can see another photogrammetry model of a zoomed in portion of the Providence Island wreck. Chris Sabick made this model. And you can see some of those mentioned features in the decking of the wreck here, and that mast laying down in the tabernacle there. And I'll mention here too, generally speaking, the photogrammetry models that we want to generate for our preserve wrecks, we really need these to be scaled to be of the greatest use for research and monitoring. And so while we want to be producing more photogrammetry models, we also still collect measurement data for these wrecks manually as well. So we're really using that new tech with older documentation methods in order to be as thorough as we can. And so, while producing photogrammetry models is a really great tool for our monitoring purposes and to display to the public, they're really not terribly useful to us as research-wise unless they're properly scaled. Our second newest wreck that we added to the preserve is the Potash Point Canal Boat. And here you can see a plan drawing for this one. And as you can see, this is in a pretty poor state of preservation comparatively. The preservation of the sides and the decking is sort of collapsed inward, it's collapsed outward, but you can still see plenty of features on this wreck, even though now it is also covered in zebra mussels. You can pick out a lot of actual diagnostic features for this wreck. This is also an easier dive. It's in about 35 feet of water. This canal boat had been carrying quarried stone, so you can see that cargo inside and underneath that collapsed decking there. There's also a windlass back towards the stern, along with a rudder post, barn door rudder, and there's cleats and fair leads for mooring lines visible all along the sides of this vessel. And here you can see a photogrammetry model of this site. And again, links to all of our photogrammetry models that I'm showing here that were produced by the museum or some of our friends. You can check these out on our website. You can manipulate them. You can spin them around. You can zoom in to see these features that I've been mentioning. So do check those out. And again, we have a lot of interested regional members of the public, folks like Gary, who are stewards of these sites and are interested in being involved with data collection for making these kinds of monitoring models. So we've also been, internally sort of throwing ideas around about the best ways to go about creating programming around this idea of crowdsourcing data. So this might be something like a citizen science program where we can train a group of interested people who are invested in protecting and monitoring these sites and maybe provide a bit of education about the kinds of data collection, and then use this data that they generate to make these models, or have people collecting water samples for ecology studies, or more simple operations like that. So again, we're not quite at this point yet, but we have, many interested and capable members of the public that could probably be very helpful in that regard. So hopefully this is another avenue that we can explore with future fundraising and programming here at the museum. And the last preserve site that I'll talk about today is the Horse Ferry site. So jumping back to one of the earlier preserve sites, this wreck was a horse-powered ferry. It basically used treadmill technology. So you can see there was this turntable that horses would walk on, but they would stay stationary and this table would turn underneath them and power the paddle wheels. And this was actually a popular model for a short period of time on the lake, beginning from about 1814 and continuing through about the 1840s. So this site was added to the preserves in 1989. And because of the fragility of this site, the museum spent 4 years documenting the site with field schools of students from Texas A&M. And so there's an artifact collection for this site. There's plan drawings, field and conservation notes. I believe a book was eventually published on this site as well. And I do think there's a few publications about the Phoenix Project as well, if people are interested in checking those out. And here you can see a photo mosaic of this site. So this is really neat. This is like the old school version of creating a photographic model of a wreck site, which is super cool to see. You can see how they've cut out these photographs and pieced them together like puzzle pieces. And this is, essentially what we're doing when we create a photogrammetry model. This is just the old school way. And so, it's especially impressive to see because this wreck is often very clouded over, meaning there's a lot of sediment in the water column. So you can see like they've gotten some pretty great clarity for this wreck to produce this model. And you can see on the one end that sort of lacks detail. That portion of the wreck is covered over by sediment. They actually put a little diver in there. I don't know if you can make them out. So yeah, just a cool bit of tech to share with you guys, especially to be able to see the difference of how far the technology has changed since this was created in the 80s. And so now, just last year, the 2024 field season, with the help of another friend of the museum, our photogrammetry expert, Kotaro Yamafune, we now have a new photogrammetry model of this site. And you can see a still of that new model here, which is really excellent. I believe there's an unscaled earlier photogrammetry model for this site that's up on our website, but you're getting a sneak preview of this one. I don't think this one is quite up yet. So thank you to Coda. We're so excited to have such a great quality model of this wreck now. And, we've also recently just started fundraising for a pilot project with Champlain College in Burlington, Vermont, where we want to partner with their students in their video game production labs so we can start using our really great photogrammetry models that we have already created and sort of world build around them so that shipwreck sites can be experienced by visitors using virtual reality headsets. So stay tuned for that, or help us with funding to help make it happen. It's been a pipe dream for a long time to be able to, make the sort of underwater shipwreck experience accessible to the public. And VR is such a great tool to be able to do that with. So we're really excited about this partnership moving forward. We're also moving our artifact collections into brand new storage at the museum. And there's a whole new reinventory process that's going on. We're trying to make our artifact catalogs and collections more accessible through a new platform. So Patricia and Kelly are going to tell you a lot more about that in greater detail later on this afternoon. So yeah, we're just trying to get the word out about all the different types of data sets and materials the museum has in our collections. So yeah, check us out, ask us questions about our collections, send us your grad students. We have plenty of work to do with just our preserve sites and collections alone. So stay tuned to our website, to our socials. Our YouTube channel has recordings of all of our past virtual conference presentations. So if you're a Rev War nerd, you'll get a kick out of that research as well. And I guess I'll leave it here. Let me try and find my way back here and stop sharing my screen and come back here. So I guess I should take some questions now. Is that is that what we do? And I'll be back for the panel as well if you think of some later too.
Yep. Yeah, we have time for a couple of questions before we get into our next presentation. So we've got a couple of good ones already flowing in.
Okay.
Real quickly, Tom asks, what are the white dots on the image of the horse ferry? Are they reference points for scaling?
I wonder which photo. Yeah, I believe they are for scaling. So you're seeing those scale bars on the outside corner. So again, that just helps us, click those measurements in and be able to actually use those in comparison to our physical measurements that we've taken as well. Chris, if you
I do
want to
think
chime
that,
in on any of this too, please.
yeah, if you don't mind me butting in here a little bit, I think that's, some of those are also the coated tiles that Coda used to place around the site, particularly in that portion on the, I believe it's the bow of the horse ferry where it's just a big, pile of sediment in that area. He did place a number of coated tiles around the site, particularly in those areas, just to make it easier to stitch the images together when it came time to do that. So I'm pretty sure that's
right. Because from what I recall, if there's nothing for those images that, you're taking so many photographs, if there's nothing for them to cling on to, it's hard to develop like the skin texture to make that turn out, right?
We have this pretty uniform gray sloppy sediment
Yeah.
on everything at the bottom of Lake Champlain, and it offers no tie points for the photogrammetry program to latch onto when you're in just a big field of mud. So using those coated tiles helps alleviate that problem quite a bit. All right.
Thanks, Chris.
I'll leave you alone.
You can
Great,
stay.
thanks.
Any other questions?
Yeah, so Mitch in the chat is wondering more about collecting information from people registering to the dive preserves, whether there's any sort of annual survey emails or whether we get any dive log data. Could you speak a little bit more about people registering for the preserves and what we know about them?
Yeah, so I know that we remind one of the pieces of data we collect when people register are their email address. So, for returning people, I think they get a general email from us. Correct me if I'm wrong again, Chris. I think that goes out at the beginning of the dive season where we're like, hey, we're starting to open up the preserves again. And so that those emails will go out. Generally, our members get those emails from us too, I'd imagine. But yeah, there's, if you want to send us your info, you'll get those you'll get those emails. Generally, our social media accounts too, like also do some kind of informational blast that's like, hey, remember to register if you're going to visit the dive preserves. But again, that data is something that we use to track just sort of internally, so the state knows how many people are accessing archaeological sites every year, and so we want to be capturing that data more closely. I think it's just always sort of been a challenge where it's like it used to be a paper form, now it's digital, but we're still not even capturing, for whatever diver registers, how many times are they visiting each site, like how many dives are they doing. We don't have that information. I think it would be cool to see that, but yeah, we're starting to brainstorm about that now, like what are some ways that we could get people more interested in connecting with us that way.
Yeah,
so
I think
yeah, if you have any
Mitch's,
ideas, reach out.
yeah, Mitch's suggestions here are really good. Whether that's a survey at the end of the year to try to gather some of that data from divers. But these are things that if you have thoughts or ideas about, please send them along, because that's something we're actively trying to figure out. As a state-sponsored system, it is imperative for us to demonstrate that the resource is being used and accessed, and that people are, to justify our continued funding for this system. So it's really in everybody's best interests for us to be able to collect as much data about visitation as possible, so that we can share that with the state and demonstrate just how important these resources are to the community at large and to the dive community specifically. So any ideas on how to better track that data? Happy to hear those.
Yeah, reach out to us.
Great, and then I think we have time for maybe one more question before
Sure.
we get to the next presentation. And again, we'll revisit any questions that we haven't gotten to at the very end with our bigger Q&A session. But we've got two that I think are just kind of related to each other, so we might as well ask them together. So Yvonne is asking, can you speak to the trend of no longer collecting items from the wrecks for display? Is it preservation, or is there more to it? And then kind of relatedly, someone is asking about what the overall method of preservation is for artifacts that you do recover, and is wondering if you mainly focus on documentation and photos of the sites, or whether you do bring up any major pieces.
Yeah, great questions. So I think, unfortunately, we're a small dive crew these days, and so that does limit our ability to be able to do more, as much as we would like to always be doing more with a lot of these sites. We often run out of time in the field season, but I will also say, for Providence Island Wreck, it's very deep. So generally speaking, you don't have a long time at the bottom, especially if you're, not on mixed gas. And we were getting, prioritizing getting models of this site and also staying safe. So, a lot of these items that I mentioned in that little description there are inside of a cabin that could collapse. And so, you know, and I will also mention that, a lot of for instance, the Horse Ferry site where they were able to do 4 years of field school. I mean, that site's pretty like accessible. I think it's in about 50 feet of water. So it was a really good site to be able to do that kind of work. Logistics would look a lot different for a site that's 85 feet deep to be able to take a lot of materials from a site like that. And also the cost of conserving these artifacts that you're taking up and doing the research that these materials really deserve. And so things are preserved as they are in situ, just underwater in Lake Champlain, right? So we use that to our advantage. And we hope that people will help us steward these sites and help take care of them, not loot them or vandalize them, so that we can still access these materials in future and learn more about them. Our second parter, remind me of some of the second parts.
What's the overall method of preserving artifacts when you do take things up from wreck?
Yeah, so it depends on the type of material. And what we, for iron, that looks like that's electrolysis first. That's manual cleaning. It's electrolysis. Then you have to do water baths and you're scrubbing. Tannic acid is applied, which is sort of a chemical reaction that keeps the iron from interacting with oxygen. So essentially keeps it from being able to rust again. And then after tannic acid, you apply a sealant. So sometimes that's a microcrystalline wax. Sometimes that's something else for some larger materials. For wood, that's wood conservation, or for objects that are more than one material type, you have to do all sorts of different things. So there's various ways of conserving each material type too. So it's really a widespread of conservation techniques. I would say that the majority of things that we conserve is iron and other metal objects, but I don't know how we are on for time, but if someone else has more specific questions about conservation, I'd love to chat with you or answer some more of those questions, specifics towards the end. But I hope I reached enough answers for that one.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Cher. All right. So for the interest of time, we're going to transition to our next presentation. So Taylor Picard, our staff archaeologist, will be presenting on the geodatabase of Lake Champlain shipwrecks. So take it away, Taylor.
Thank you, Sarah. I really appreciate the introduction. Let's share. So, my name is Taylor Picard. I'm the staff archaeologist here at the museum. And I'm going to be talking about a new geodatabase that we're currently building for Lake Champlain that covers both sides, the New York side and the Vermont side of the lake, and the entire extent of the lake. So, for those that are here, I just want to make clear, this is going to be a more introducing the ideas of a geodatabase and GIS and how we're starting to implement it here at the museum. For those of you that might have GIS experience already, this is going to be very fundamental information that you probably already know. But hopefully you have a few ideas or you gain a few ideas from this talk. And these are sort of the topics I'll be going through. So since I am new to the museum, I just want to introduce myself. I graduated Humboldt State in Northern California in 2019 with my bachelor's degree, and I have a minor in geospatial analysis. I've been doing GIS for about 10 years now, archaeology for about 8 or 9. And then I went to East Carolina University in 2022. I've worked all over the place. I'm really happy to be here at the museum. It's been a great place, a great experience for me, but I've worked in the Pacific Northwest, the American Southwest, the Mid-Atlantic, and out here. My thesis was actually studying a World War II U.S. Army Air Force crash boat. which is how I got connected with the museum, because there is a boat here just off of Valcor Island, and they're a relatively under-researched vessel. So I reached out to Chris while I was writing my thesis and got as much information as we have available. And, you know, came up in 2021 as the Lake Champlain photogrammetry intern. So you'll see a lot of my work on the Sketchfab website. And I came back this last June. I'm very happy to be here. So Lake Champlain has a very long history of archaeology, actually. Last year marked the 90th anniversary, which started with Lorenzo Haglund when he began work to raise the gunboat Philadelphia in 1934. In the early 1960s to late 1990s, archaeological work and accessioning of archaeological material was carried on by Bill Liege and the Lake Champlain Archaeological Associates. And then in 1980, the Champlain Maritime Society was founded by Art Cohn, which eventually transitioned into the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum as we know it today. And that institute, us, continue to conduct archaeological work on Lake Champlain. All of these individuals and organizations made great contributions to Lake Champlain archaeology. And for the first time, we're going to be able to put all of their work together into one consolidated database and really pull all these resources together. So what is GIS? GIS is a Geographic Information System. It's a tool that is used across the globe in a variety of industries to create, store, manage, analyze, and visualize spatial data. Datasets are organized in a data document as layers. Datasets can either be represented as a roster or a vector, but never at the same time. Roster, you'll see this sort of cell structure, and each cell has a value. And then as a vector data set, it's represented as points, lines, polylines, or polygons. And you can see on that left image the difference between those types of datas, and then on the right, how that layering structure sort of looks. And it, breaks down the real world into these layer sets. So, you have these street data, building, vegetation, and that will then all be compiled to create a map document that shows what the real world actually looks like. So some of the types of data that we use in GIS is just immense. Common types of data sets that we use in archaeology that can be managed in GIS include photographs, typically aerial photographs that can show on a medium and large scale changes that happen over time. It also makes it possible to overlay digitized historic maps with contemporary maps and add the resources shown on the historic maps to the database. We can add new data that we collect in the field. This includes side scan sonar mosaics, that some of which Paul will be talking about in his presentation, GIS waypoints and tracks, which we've have shown in the past with the Arnold's Bay research. Additionally, we can add advanced remote sensing technologies like light detection and ranging, otherwise known as LiDAR. And all of these help us create an image of the environment around us. And GIS is very instrumental in visualizing that image. So just to give you a quick idea, side scan sonar mosaic creates a very basic image of the bottom. And is actually a type of raster data. And then LiDAR will take hundreds of thousands of data points to create a 3D representation of the landscape, and that's a type of vector data. And then we can look at that to find the footprint of archaeological material, archaeological sites on these medium to large scales. Additionally, we could take the data that we produce, these photogrammetry models or CAD models, and we can import it into GIS and represent it on a map or even as a 3D visualization. But the most important part is that all of these data sets have associated attribute tables. And GIS is amazing at handling all types of tables, Excel tables, things like that. And we're able to link all types of information to locational data. So that way you can quickly and easily look at an area and pull all that information, run different types of analyses. But the first step is to build a geodatabase. And this is where we organize all of that data. We can add specific tools that we frequently use. Typically, most tools are already included in GIS, but we could add some custom tools. One of my favorite tools that I like to use is known as the Relief Visualization tool. And it's used with LiDAR data to help make subtle features stand out. Otherwise, it's just sort of a gray mass, and this adds a lot of different color, which brings out that texture that we wouldn't normally really be able to see. But one of the big advantages of having a database is that it allows and promotes multi-user access. So that way, once we have this going, all of our archaeology team can access the database, and we could be conducting these researches on a larger scale as a full team accessing it. And it can be hosted on a cloud or a server. It's very flexible that way. And all these users, as long as that data is on that cloud or that server, they can access all of that data. So that's why it's really important to have that geodatabase in place so that all of that's together and we can share that. And then we can share that as well with our partners and our clients. However, GIS is not perfect. The biggest flaw is that it's only as powerful as the data that we provide it. While we can keep adding all sorts of data, if we add bad data, it really limits the availability of GIS to do the work. So one of the big issues is what was known as selective availability. Prior to the year 2000, GPS usage in the civilian sector suffered from this. It caused GPS devices to be less accurate and than those that were being used in the military. There were some ways to account for this inaccuracy, but it would never be 100% correct. You can see actually in that top right image the transition on May 2nd, 2000 at 4:00 a.m. when selective availability was turned off. So this graph actually represents the amount of error the GPS was receiving, and it was actually turned off by an executive order signed by Bill Clinton. And it just really decreases the amount of error, and that means it makes our data more accurate. However, we still deal with a lot of issues that can account for bad signal strength. This mostly is caused by a variety of conditions, most notably signal obstructions, trees, buildings, things like that. When that satellite signal passes through, it can reflect and cause a bad reading. It could bounce off the surface of water, things like that. And we still have to account for these types of issues. Now, the problem is getting better. Every year, our technology advances step by step, and we're able to have more accurate GPS. Just in the last couple of years, I've been recording GPS data that has 6-inch accuracy, which is amazing. It's really unbelievable. But you can see, depending on the type of receiver, it can really vary on what that GPS accuracy looks like. One large problem that we face in maritime archaeology is actually trying to map resources underwater because GPS signal can't penetrate a water surface very effectively. So we have to come up with unique solutions on how do we map underwater archaeological sites and add it to this geodatabase. And then ultimately, if we are bad at managing the data, it all falls apart. So we have to constantly be on our game to manage the data in a really accurate and efficient way. So that way our geodatabase stays as efficient as possible. So once our geodatabase is established, it's possible to quickly, effectively manage and manipulate data. This means we can constantly make changes to the data that we collect so that it's the most accurate image of the resources on the lake bed. And to some degree, we could actually correct the issues that we've encountered, either with legacy data or the data we collect in the field. Once corrected once we correct or remove the bad data, we can start the analysis process of the data to identify potential patterns or relationships. And we could also use this to develop management strategies for complex sites. Quite a few of our shipwreck sites are multi-resource. It's multiple wrecks, or the wreck has deteriorated. Potash Point is a really good example where the condition of the wreck has sort of fallen apart and it's become spread out. And it's a more complex site than some of our other wrecks. Finally, we can visualize and track historic data to help answer questions on a much larger scale, rather than just looking at one single site or region on the lake. So this could be something as simple as looking at shipping logs and mapping that out on the geodatabase, and we can then visualize it and produce a product for the museum that helps tell that story of what's going on, particularly during the canal boat era. And we can show that how big was this canal boat industry. So the current status of the geodatabase is almost all of the 1996 to 2004 lake survey resources have been added, as well as all the Vermont underwater dive preserve wrecks. And several of the wrecks have been identified in previous work done by the museum have also been added. This includes sites like the Pine Street Barge Canal wrecks that did not get captured by the lake survey because they're in an incredibly shallow environment and could not be captured by side scan sonar, and are not part of the dive preserve system. And there have also been some other resources that were located by underwater explorers and reported to the museum, such as Gary LaFay. And right now, each resource is only represented in the database by a single point that reflects the location of the resource. And then I've added some basic information about the resources that's included in that attribute table for each dot. And this data includes when the resource was found, who located it, the type and classification. So is it a shipwreck? Is it a car? Is it an airplane? And then we can categorize it as a canal boat or a lake schooner. And then also we include information about when it was built and when it sank. So right now here's a snippet of the preserve wrecks. So you can see how this is represented on the GIS database. And the lake actually is represented by a depth map that I've created based off the bathymetry data that's available to the public. And I've written the interpolation model, and we can keep updating that as well as we collect more bottom depth data. We can add that and create new, updated, more accurate depth models of the lake. And then at the bottom of the screen is what that attribute table looks like for the preserve wreck sites and the type of data that we have for that. Obviously, I'm still in the process of building this and adding this data. It's not as simple as a click of a button, all the data just appears. Sometimes it is, but in this case, it's not. So moving forward, with the future of shipwreck mapping, we're going to continue to add resources and make this database comprehensive. So we will be adding the work that's been conducted by Lorenzo Haglin and Bill Liege and their associates, and just really start building this this comprehensive database, as well as taking in the data that's provided us by lake explorers. Eventually, I would like to replace all of these points with a polygon that really encompasses the full size of each site. So as you can see here, this is our 3D model of Potash Point, and the arrow pointing to where Potash Point is down there on the South Lake. And the latitude and longitude are available on the website for the dive preserve system. And we can geo-reference that 3D model and put it into the GIS. And that way there's an actual representation of the shipwreck in GIS. So because we're specifically using ArcGIS, which is produced by Esri, we have access to a full suite of Esri tools that enable us to equip ourselves and our partners with the ability to collect data in the field and send it straight to our geodatabase. Two of the most important tools used in archaeology on a widespread scale is Survey 123 and Field Maps. And this collects data in the field, which is uploaded to a cloud, and then we download it and we add it to the geodatabase. Using these tools, we can develop a training program in the future to train volunteer lake explorers and our partner organizations to send us new data in a quick, easy to use, and streamlined manner. These tools have a unidirectional relationship with the database, which means the software sends the data to the cloud, but it does not allow the user to access the database and potentially alter the data we already have. And it also, restricts access to confidential archaeological site data. So there's a sense of security in place. So it's not just something that we hand out. And in the future, when we develop this program, it wouldn't be something that we hand out and then everybody has access to everything. It would be well thought out, well developed, and there would be limited access because some of these shipwreck sites are not available for the public, and that would include our volunteer lake explorers. So to wrap up, ArcGIS is a very powerful tool that will allow the museum to compile centuries of historical data and almost 100 years of archaeological work on Lake Champlain. And it will allow us to analyze this data, develop more thorough research, resource management strategies, and equip citizen scientists and partners with new tools. This will help us expand our new database far beyond where we are now. And I honestly couldn't even tell you what the future would look like in terms of this. So I will take a moment to, why is there we are, to answer some questions.
Great. So one question, and this is kind of related to photogrammetry. So anyone else who has stuff to add, feel free to jump back on. But Nathan is asking if there are plans to process further photogrammetry models in the future to compare with older models so that you can study the shifting of wrecks and possible erosion and changes to the wrecks.
Absolutely, we are working on a plan to do that, and also equipped volunteer divers, created a training program to equip volunteer divers with GoPros, so they could also collect some of that data for us, specifically for the preserve wrecks. It is still in a very early stage of planning, but we are working on that.
All right. So it looks, Wayne is asking about aircraft. When we're talking about things that are in the bottom of the lake, I know we're talking a lot about ships, but Wayne is wondering if we know how many aircraft have gone down in the lake or part of the database.
Yeah, it is part of the database actually. Aircraft are a category that I've created. There are two that we know about. There's obviously the jet from the 70s, and then there is the infamous story of the CB, which is just north of Westport. That one is up on our website if you want to read more about it. But it was just a seaplane in the 1940s that crashed. Nobody Nobody died in the accident. Everyone survived, but as they were towing the plane, it sunk while they were towing it to the other side of the lake, back to the New York side.
Great. Thanks, Taylor.
The pilot attempted to land on the lake without retracting his landing gear and relying just on the pontoons, and that caused the boat to flip over, and then it sank.
Yeah,
There are certainly a number of other plane wrecks. I don't have an exact number that I could put forward. I know of at least 4. And undoubtedly there are probably some more.
Great. Thanks, guys. So with that, I think we're going to go ahead and switch over to Paul's presentation. So next up, we've got Paul Gates, our co-director of archaeology, who will be presenting on cultural resource management and the Champlain Hudson Power Express project. So take it away, Paul.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And thank you, everybody who is here at our Virtual Archaeology Conference. I appreciate you making the time and effort, and hope everyone is enjoying themselves. Now, if you give me just 1 second, I'm going to share my screen. Okay. All right. 1 second. All right. So welcome. Thank you for making time once again. For my presentation, we are going to talk about the Champlain Hudson Power Express project and underwater cultural resource management. But of course, before I can start this, I need to thank all the people that have been involved, as you can see at the very bottom of the screen. First off, thank you to our contractor, TRC Companies. Also, thank you to Transmission Developers Incorporated, Hydro-Quebec, the Chippy team, which is the acronym for Champlain Hudson Power Express, the Cable Installing Company, NKT, ASO Subsea, Ocean Surveys Incorporated, Caldwell Marine International, and finally, the New York Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. This project really wouldn't have been able to happen without the help of all those entities, organizations, and more. So thank you. Now, some of you in the audience may or may not be wondering, what is underwater cultural resource management? Also, how's the museum involved? Well, using the definition from the National Park Bulletin 28, Cultural Resource Management Guideline, quote, cultural resource management involves research to identify, evaluate, document, register, and establish other basic information about cultural resources. Planning to ensure that this information is well integrated into management processes for making decisions and setting priorities. And finally, stewardship, under which planning decisions are carried out and resources are preserved, protected, and interpreted to the public, unquote. Now here we can see, this is a modified diagram from Joseph Flatman's Cultural Resource Management and Related Roles book from his book, Becoming an Archaeologist, A Guide to Professional Pathway. And this was modified by me in Adobe Acrobat, Adobe Photoshop, just to kind of include some more parts and pieces that are involved. And as you can see, there's just a myriad of roles that are involved. We have consultants, we have forensic specialists, we have our people in business, historic building specialists, conservators, the public, people doing outreach for the public. And more or less this big sphere of cultural resource management, and then all these other little spheres around it. The management of underwater cultural resources is more or less the same with this type of model and this flow. And what do we do? So underwater cultural resource management involves working with clients in development, energy, transportation, and infrastructure projects. Generally, this work is done in accordance with state and federal regulations, such as Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. Let's see, I lost my train of thought there. So how do we fit into this work? We work as stewards to investigate, research, document, analyze, plan, and if needed, mitigate for the protection of underwater cultural resources. More importantly, our work is assisting in determining underwater cultural resources and whether or not they're potentially eligible or not eligible to the National Register of Historic Places, along with state registers of historic places. And all the underwater archaeologists here at the museum, we meet very specific qualifications set forth by the Secretary of the Interior's professional standards for historic preservation under the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 1112 or 112, and Section 106 regulations. And as you can see here from the slide, the museum really does have a really good proven track record of doing underwater cultural resource management. I don't know the exact number of years, but maybe Chris Saban can answer this afterwards. It's certainly over 30 years worth of work. And as some examples we can see here from the slide, there's the work that we did at the Pine Street Barge Canal Superfund site, looking at abandoned barge canal vessels. Also, we did an underwater survey of the old Champlain Bridge before the new bridge replaced it. We did work for another Superfund site in Lake Onondaga in Syracuse, New York. Work on Matin Shipyard in Cohoes, New York. Work to document the entire historic fleet and modern fleet of New York State Canal Corporation, and also working for some other jobs outside of, Vermont and a little bit farther out of the Hudson River Valley, such as the Rockaway, New York project. In addition to these projects and many other projects, we also do a lot of contract conservation work. Now, getting into the heart of the presentation. I don't know if anyone really knows about the Chippy project, but for those who don't, we're going to start with some background information. This endeavor is the result of planning by New York State to reach its renewable energy goals, and in partnership with Hydro-Quebec, the largest renewable energy producer in North America, Transmission Developers Incorporated, and a host of international and state entities. Chippy is currently focused on 2 projects in the Northeast region of the United States. One of them is what we're talking about today, Champlain Hudson Power Express, which is a fully buried line located basically from the border of Quebec, going down through the New York side on Lake Champlain, going through the Hudson River, and then ultimately going into the Harlem River to a substation on Astoria, Queens, New York City. And then the second big project is, let's see, what is that project? It's New England Clean Power Link, which is another fully cabled burial project for a transmission line located in Vermont that will serve New England markets. So the project route for Chippy has been carefully designed to have a very minimal footprint using waterways and existing rights-of-way to remain out of sight and also avoid environmentally sensitive areas. The project will run from the US-Canadian border, as I mentioned before, from Quebec, and eventually we're ending at the converter station in Astoria, Queens, New York City. And the project is installing a high voltage direct current energy transmission line as a time-tested technology that transmits power over long distances more efficiently than alternating or AC current. In addition, high voltage direct current does not produce controversial electromagnetic fields associated with AC transmission. And the cable will be installed using low impact water jet technology that minimally impacts the environment. And we can see here from the slide that is the actual route that we're looking at for the entire Champlain Hudson Power Express line. And if you want to learn more about Chippy, please go to the link at the very bottom of the screen here, and you can learn everything that you want to know about this project. Now, in order for us to start, we had to go through permitting. In fact, not only did the museum have to do some permitting work or help with assisting in permitting, but it's really the cable installer, all the various companies that needed to go through. And you can see that here are some examples of the permits. There were numerous state and federal and local authorities that needed to be reviewing the projects and permits associated with Chippy. A lot of the US government agencies had to provide federal permits and approval as well. And also, we worked a lot with the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, specifically in the permitting needs that relate to underwater cultural resources. And again, these are just some examples of permitting that you can see here, and those permits are available on the Chippy website. With permitting secured, the Chippy project was officially underway in 2024, with installation activities taking place in both Lake Champlain and Hudson River. And to give a better idea of the scale of this project, here are some examples of construction vessels and equipment used for the work. To the left, we see an assemblage of barges, support vessels, cranes, cable spooling, and other construction equipment in Lake Champlain at Rouse's Point. The assemblage of construction equipment is laying the cable between the opening of the historic remains of the Rouse's Point Railroad Trestle between Alburgh, Vermont, and Rouse's Point, New York. And then to the right, we see one of ASO Subsea's cable laying vessels, Atalante. Atalante is a specially designed and engineered cable laying vessel that really is able to operate in very shallow environments and lay cables in there, which is really not accessible for larger vessels that can do the same job. As you can see from the specs here, Atalante can handle at least 4,500 tons of cable in a electrically and hydraulically operated turntable. It has a maximum draught of about 4.65 meters. You can beach this vessel, and it has a series of spuds on 4 points of the vessel that basically allow it to be moored in place depending on the bottom and how deep it is. Here's some examples, some other equipment that are being used as well. So what we can see here are construction burial equipment. And this kind of medieval prelay grapnel tool that we see to the far left, that's actually a clearing tool that is used in pre-construction activities. So what they do is they let this grapnel anchor, this grapnel cable be let out along the planned path of the transmission line. And what it does is it helps to clear the path of anything like abandoned cable, fishing nets, anything that might be in the way that is not an underwater cultural resource. I want to be very specific about that. And then the other two machines that we see off to the right here, these are actually the types of cable burial tools that are used. Both are dragged, well, not dragged, but they're towed off the back of a installation vessel. And the hydroplow tool basically is able to skid on the bottom of a river or marine environment or lake environment. And the cable will be spooled through it, and it will be plowing and then burying the cable. And then this kind of larger treaded machine, this is a remedial burial tool. It more or less operates the same way. You can feed the cable through it, but instead of using this water jet system, which is what the hydroplow uses, I believe that this tool can also use a trenching tool, which you can kind of see in between the middle of it, along with water jet technology. And so going into everything that we've done for this work, as you can see here from the slide, basically what we're doing right now is we're looking at the Lake Champlain segment of the Chippy project. And initially, this project started back in the spring of 2009 and ended in the late summer of 2011. And this work consisted of a Phase 1A survey, or mostly background research, that included historic research, site file research, review of cultural resource information from existing remote sensing surveys, data analysis from new remote sensing surveys, and technical reporting. The project, however, had paused sometime in the early 2010s, only to start back up quite recently since late 2002, where Lake Champlain Maritime Museum came in as a contractor to do research, analysis, and interpretation of underwater cultural resources in Lake Champlain. And here we see the planning route for Lake Champlain. The survey company that worked with everyone is known as Ocean Surveys Incorporated. And what they were able to do was they performed a multi-sensor geophysical marine route survey, or MRS, in Lake Champlain to support construction planning for the Chippy Submarine Power Cable Project. Previous investigations that were completed by OSI in 2012 supported environmental permitting, engineering, and pre-construction phases on the project, and were integral in the current planning for the marine route survey. And you can see here in the slide, this is one of OSI's survey vessels, RV Able 2. And these are the specs for it, and the list, if anyone can read, that is all the equipment for remote sensing that the vessel used to generate data and gather information. So we have everything multi-beam sonar systems, we have magnetometers, we've got side scan sonar systems, and then sub-bottom profiler system. And really those 4 pieces of tech were instrumental in the work that we did for our data interpretation and analysis. To allow for flexibility in planning, the final submarine cable alignment, the MRS focused on acquiring high-resolution geophysical survey data to document surface and subsurface conditions within a 300-foot wide cable corridor centered on the proposed cable alignment. Now, in addition to the investigations along the cable alignment, there are these numerous reroutes or other investigations that were done to really find the best constructible corridor for this project, while avoiding impediments to the installation, such as rock outcrops, shipwrecks, and steep slopes identified during the survey. And you can see that there are some examples of imagery here from that process data that we're able to find. At the very top, we have a side scan sonar image showing a suspected uncharted wreck, which was interpreted as a sunken barge, pretty close to the center line of the marine route survey corridor. And further down below, we can see more quality or different types of interpretations of side-scan sonar data and multi-beam soundings. We can see to the right, there are images of debris with multiple debris piles and small linear features, most likely from bridge remains. And to the left is just another multi-beam image showing the same type of data. And out of our analysis of the remote sensing data from OSI, institutional records, previous data sets, and historic research, we found numerous shipwrecks within the area for the construction cable corridor, along with 3 major cross-lake features in the path of the Chippy submarine route that we had to mitigate for. These included the remains of the old Route 2 toll bridge, the Rouse's Point Railroad Bridge or train trestle, the Great Bridge of 1777 between Fort Ticonderoga and Mount Independence, and finally, the Larrabee's Point, Lillis Point Railroad Trestle. Here we see as an example of one of those features, the Great Bridge, a mosaic of the processed sonar, magnetometer, and bathymetric data. So for those of you who don't know, sonar really allows us to see anomalies in the lake or any other body of water And then the magnetometer allows us to identify magnetic signatures that may or may not be associated with shipwrecks or other potential submerged cultural resources. And we can see here from previous research and thesis work that was done by Scott McLaughlin on the 1777 Great Bridge as a conjectural view. You know, these are the caissons that we see. And then just kind of using my cursor here, these blocks are representative of the location of these caissons. And there are some, remains of caissons that are not really intact. They're basically big Lincoln Long structures filled with stone, and they're used as the base supports for this bridge that initially went between Fort Ticonderoga on the New York side of the lake and Mount Independence on the Vermont side of the lake. In addition to this data we have here, we also did a underwater metal detecting survey where we physically had divers in the water in zero visibility conditions, surveying with a metal detector to see if we could pick up anything else that the magnetometer was not able to pick up during the survey. So a lot of work. And here is another really great example. I wish I could go through all of them, but this is a example of the process data in a sonar mosaic with the side scan sonar, bathymetry, and magnetometer points. As you can see here, red triangles are magnetometer points. These little green squares are survey, side scan sonar targets. And then what we found was we found kind of right in here and right here, this boxy structure, that is the remains of this draw boat right here from this historic image. And this draw boat, when the Larrabee's Point and Willow Point drawbridge, railroad trestle was made, it still had to allow for traffic to flow in between it. Steamboats, sailboats, other people who needed to get to the southern end of the lake. So what the engineers did when they were creating this railroad trestle is they made this big draw boat, essentially a massive wooden barge that operated on a series of winches and steam power that could literally be drawn out or moved out of the way so that steam vessels and other ships could transit either north or south through one point of the lake to the other. And then when that was done, this big draw boat would swing right back in, close, lock up, and allow trains to continue to either go to the New York side of Lake Champlain or to the Vermont side. Really, really cool information to find. And since we only have so much time in this presentation to talk about all the segments, I want to switch gears to more of an abbreviated version of the Hudson River portion of the Chippy project. Let's see. So the Hudson River segment was more complex than either the Lake Champlain segment or the Harlem River segment, and it just generated this wealth of data on a variety of submerged cultural resources. Getting ahead of myself here. Much like the work that we did in Lake Champlain, the goal of the work was to research, analyze, interpret, and mitigate any underwater cultural resources along the Marine Route Survey channel in the Hudson River. And these images here, it is representative of the route of the Chippy line in the upper Hudson River going down into the lower Hudson River that we see over here. So there are basically two segments, one from Summerton to Stony Point, and then the next one from Congers to the Harlem River. During the fall and winter of 2022 and 2023, Ocean Surveys performed another multi-sensor geophysical marine route survey of the Hudson River to support construction and planning efforts for the Chippy project. The investigations were completed on an approximately 88-mile reach, with 67 miles being the upper Hudson River, 21 miles being in the lower Hudson River segment. And the methodology for remote sensing was very similar to what was done in Lake Champlain. And just to give you an idea of what the process data looks like from multi-beam soundings, up here, we can see this is actually a challenging area of the Hudson River. We have a significant slope grade. We have a lot of rock outcrops. And these little kind of yellowish circles here, these are actually shipwrecks. So in order to do work and really have this line properly installed and planned out, even before installing, planning out the route. The archaeologists on staff, the engineers, the surveyors, and a whole host of other specialists just had to look at this data and figure out what can we avoid, what can we just not impact so that we don't have to run into any remediation or mitigation issues in order just to get this project planned out. So just very, very complex. And if we see down here, this is the distribution of the side scan sonar targets and the magnetometer anomalies located amongst both corridors in the Hudson River. And you can just see here that there are thousands, I'd say thousands and thousands of sonar targets and anomalies that we had to interpret to see whether they're shipwrecks or not. And out of these anomalies that we were able to analyze and interpret, we found a total of about 66 sonar anomalies interpreted as possible wrecks in what's known as the area of potential effect, or the APE, of the Chipney submarine power line cable corridor. And this is an example of one of the wrecks that was identified through the side scan sonar data. Unfortunately, we cannot share the location of this wreck because of its confidentiality. But what we can do is we can analyze it based off of our knowledge, our research, our background, our skills, and really kind of look at this image here and determine what it is. And from looking at this, we were able to determine that this is either a sloop or a schooner, likely a Hudson River sloop, from maybe late 18th century, certainly throughout the 19th century. And the reason why we know it's a sloop or a schooner is because of the shape of the vessel. So we're looking top down at the bottom of the Hudson River. And with schooners, they really have this kind of like beautifully curved, like bluff bow and a really sharp transom or stern. And off of it, usually there are these bowsprits, as we can see here. And then in this diagram, a bowsprit coming here, here, and then right off of the vessel here as it's under sail in the Hudson River. And you can see like the data is just so detailed that we can even see little tiny hatch coming right here. Because we didn't have any other information on this wreck, we don't know what it is, the name of it, or its condition aside from what we can see, but we knew that it's mostly intact and also, really partially buried with some overburden that we see on this side. So sediment and debris that has washed over and have been deposited on the wreck. Here's another example of a vessel that we found. We don't know the name of it. We're only referring to it by the sonar number that was identified during the route survey work. Again, we are redacting locational information of this data, but we found that it was pretty sizable. It's about 100 feet long, about maybe 14 feet approximately in beam or in width. And off the height, the bottom of the Hudson River, it's about 2 feet above. But it's kind of difficult to determine what this was without looking through more historic research. And this is potentially Don't quote me on this, but potentially the remains of a Delaware and Hudson canal boat. And we can see here from this historic image, this type of canal vessel was used on the Hudson and Delaware canals. It's a lot different from the canal boats that we see here in Lake Champlain region, or that would have been going out on the Erie Canal. And these were quite large vessels. They had very rounded, bluff sterns and bows, as we can see here. But again, we really don't have a lot more information on this vessel aside from what we can visually see and interpret, and anything that's based off of historic research and previous surveys that was already done within this area. Last but not least, we are going to be moving on to the very final segment of the Chippy project. And this is in the Harlem River. A little bit easier to do this work as the Harlem River is pretty short. It's about 6 miles of reach between up here where the Spuyten-Duville Railroad Bridge is to down here around the Willis Avenue Spring Bridge in New York City. And there were previous marine route survey investigations that were done in order to support this project. And we can see that this is the actual map of the survey line of where it's going. And if we continue to move further on, because we only have so much time to talk about underwater cultural resources and the other shipwrecks that we found, this is just a representative example of what we know that does exist in the Harlem River. So one of the survey targets here, S18355, with redacted information. Sorry. We had some initial dimensional width, length, and height from OSI. And in fact, this is a known wreck from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's automated wrecks, obstructions, and information database. That's a mouthful, so how about we just refer to it as the acronym of the NOAA AWOIS. Now, the NOAA AWOIS, that data system, has been discontinued for the past couple of years, but it's still very valuable for us to do cross-referencing with newer data sets. So as we're looking at the location of this wreck, we found that the NOAA data point for a wreck was pretty much right on top of it as we're looking through in GIS. And it might be a little bit hard to see, but this is partially buried. It's in pretty rough shape, but we can see these longitudinal lines, almost rectangles going down, kind of a heavy line here, perpendicular, and then another heavyish line there off to the side. And in work that I've done outside of the Maritime Museum, I actually was able to, with a different company, drop an ROV on this vessel for a different project. And we found that it was a barge. It was a wooden scow barge. We can't really say that like it looks like exactly like a barge that you would see nowadays, but just to give you a representative example, this is what it more or less would have looked like. And scow barges are very specific because the bow and the stern, so the back end and the forward end of the vessel, they have these things called raked ends. So basically these ends of wooden beams coming from the bottom and then raking up at an angle. And that is how we get this very beautiful sharp shape to the vessel that we see here on this historic photograph. And some other examples of submerged cultural resources that we're looking at, a lot of dock infrastructure, a lot of the remains of pilings, piers, wooden remnants of wharves that we found, mostly on the eastern and western side of the river. And when we're looking at the data, this is how it is coming up to us. This is what we have to interpret. So we have a cable route here in the Harlem River. And then, we identified several pilings. This is actually from OSI. They did the identification. We just did the interpretation of it and the analysis. But, they found multiple relic timbers and pilings kind of scattered all throughout the area. And they saw that as a potential impediment to the line. We're able to highlight them and share that data with us. And then here's another example. It might be a little bit hard to see, but this is another sonar and magnetometer mosaic. And this is the eastern shoreline of the Harlem River. This down here is the western shoreline. And I can't really, zoom in, but if we see really closely the letters OS, OB, STN, here, 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 and these little circles, this stands for obstruction, along with this and this. And again, we're seeing these really kind of detailed linear features, almost stacked rectangles or kind of Lincoln logs on top of each other. And through the work that we did in GIS with the help of Taylor Picard, our GIS guru here at the Maritime Museum, they found that there were historic docks and piers all up and down the Harlem River. And to give our audience a better sense of what one of these docks or piers or wharves would look like, here is an image from the New York Library. Thank you, New York Public Library, from 1935. Sorry, I was going to say 1835. 1935, showing a pier off of Manhattan around East 120th Street. And, it's probably might not be existent today, but what we do know is we do know the archaeological remains. And so with all of that, we covered Lake Champlain, we covered the Hudson River, we covered the Harlem River. Where are we with Chippy now? Well, our contractor, our partners, and the museum, we have completed our reports on the Underwater Cultural Resource Review of the Chippy project for all segments. We also did some work of archaeological monitoring. So as we were identifying and analyzing various shipwrecks in all three of these waterways, we actually had to do some mitigation work because some of them were pretty close to the line. And in order to protect and preserve those shipwrecks, we basically have to work with engineers, the surveyors, look at the data and say, hey, this is the point in which we're seeing this one vessel. If we can, please alter the line outside so that it's protecting this vessel by X number of feet. And those feet are usually within these buffer zones. So we will draw this buffer of maybe 100 feet or 200 feet around a known shipwreck around that sonar target and say to the surveyors and to the engineers, please, if you can, alter the route by X number of feet, either to the east or the west, so that we can be avoiding these underwater cultural resources, so they're not being impacted or potentially destroyed by any of the construction works that's happening. So that's what we did. There's one wreck that was maybe a little bit close. We actually had several, and we did some monitoring in real time, looking at sonar systems of the installation tool as it was constructing and laying the cable, mostly in the Hudson River. And we could see like, okay, the shipwreck is pretty far off from the sonar system. We don't see it coming up. And then basically the data that we've been using is so precise and so specific that, everyone did an amazing amount of work so that we could, and we're able to avoid pretty much every single shipwreck that we found in not only Lake Champlain, but the Hudson River, in addition to the Harlem River. We have also conducted training. So we had to work with construction crews and saying, what do you do if you find an unanticipated discovery? So let's say the construction crews are out, they're working, they find maybe a part of a shipwreck that wasn't in our initial data sets that we didn't find. We were able to train up a variety of crews and saying like, hey, if you do find something and you're unsure what it is, these are some examples. This is an example of a 18th century grapnel anchor. This is an example of a canal boat. These are examples of other larger artifacts or cultural resources that may or may not be found as an unanticipated discovery. And then, of course, what do you do if you encounter it? How do you further protect the site if damage does occur so that you can really enhance its preservation and protect it? And moving forward, the Chippy construction project is still going. It's not fully done yet, but as stewards and professional underwater cultural resource managers, we are continuously reviewing each segment of the Chippy project on a case-by-case basis, depending on the demand for work. And as professional cultural resource managers, the archaeology department at the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, we are committed in working with our partners on the Chippy project and any other further contract jobs. The data provided by OSI has enhanced our understanding of the locations of some underwater archaeological resources and will aid in future work for research, planning, and stewardship of the work done in Lake Champlain, the Hudson River, in addition to the Harlem River. While work is still ongoing and the Chippy line is still being installed, we continue to strive for excellence in the protection and preservation of our irreplaceable cultural resources in an ever-changing world. And with that, I will stop sharing soon and open everything up to questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Paul. We have several questions, so I think we're going to hold some of these for the final Q&A, and we can get to a couple of them now. So Zach is asking about the shipwrecks that you were describing in your talk. He's wondering if these wrecks were previously undiscovered and they were just discovered during this process, or what's the story with these wrecks?
So the story with the majority of the wrecks that we were able to work on, they had already been known to New York State. So we had a really great data set from the Department of Environmental Conservation that did some work I'm assuming it's before my time, in doing side scan sonar. And so we had those data sets. And then with data sets that were done in previous surveys, we're able to use that to augment and enhance our analysis. But honestly, there were a lot, especially some of the bigger vessels like that Delaware and Hudson River Canal boat, that who knows if anybody even knew that was at the bottom of the Hudson River.
Great, thanks. And Brent is asking about the cable trenching vehicles that you were talking about, and how do they navigate significant underwater geologic features? Do they lay cable around them? What is kind of the process with that?
Well, with that sled that we were looking at, the hydro plow, that tool specifically, it uses a water jet in order to trench. So as it's at the bottom of the Hudson, it just shoots out this minimal impact jet of water, and that cuts the trench, but it can only cut a trench in soft sediment, sand, mud. It can't go through rock. And this is more or less the same thing, if I'm saying this correctly, with the trenching tool. The trenching tool can only go through a specific substrate. So with the work that the engineers have done on this project, they really had to avoid any rock outcrops where trenching was not needed. Might be kind of overstating this, but there were areas where they really couldn't avoid. They could not avoid any rocky bottoms. But what they were able to do was they were able to lay the cable on top of this bedding of concrete mattresses that not only protected the cable, but also protected the bottomlands of the environment that it was in.
Great. And then it looks like we've got time for one more before our next presentation. So Glenn is asking about the caissons from the 1775 bridge that you had talked about. What happens to cultural resources like that you identify in the area of the shipping project? Will they be impacted by the cable? Will they get to stay in place? What kind of happens there?
Thankfully, those underwater cultural resources like those caissons, they are staying in place. They are not being impacted in any way whatsoever. And really going back to just the marvel of how specific and refined all the engineers and surveyors and GIS specialists were able to work this route out. It provided a very clear route so that we were able to avoid things like the Great Bridge, where these caissons, they're kind of close together. But with the technology and with the methods that are being used, it's really not being impacted while allowing for construction to proceed.
Awesome. Great to hear. Thanks, Paul. We're going to get into our next presentation and again, circle back to any questions we haven't yet gotten to at the very end. So next up, we have Patricia Reed, our collections manager, and Kelly Bartlett, our collections assistant, and they will be presenting on their work on the accessibility of the museum's collections. So Patricia and Kelly, take it away.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining today. So just sharing our screen here. So thanks, Sarah, for that excellent introduction. Kelly and I make up the collections team here at the Maritime Museum. I joined the team here in 2016 as an intern in our lab. We'll be talking more about that soon. And I also studied archaeology in undergrad, so really excited to be joining in today.
And my name is Kelly Bartlett. I'm the collections assistant here at the museum. My background is in information science, and I've been primarily dealing with our institutional records and donated objects. However, as you'll see, there's a lot of exciting work going on with our archaeological collection. So looking forward to chatting today. Okay, so to give a brief overview of our presentation, we want to orient you all to the museum and our collection, and then talk about some of the challenges and opportunities around our archaeological collections management at the museum. We're working hard to make all of our collections more accessible to the public and researchers. So we'll talk about how we've been doing that in terms of best practices for policies, protocols, and data management. And then we'll stop sharing this presentation for a minute and we'll take you kind of behind the scenes to our collections management database, catalog it. And we'll show you how all of these policies and protocols actually work in practice. And then we'll wrap up our talk with a couple of practical tips and ways that you can store and care for your archaeological collections.
Great. So we care for thousands of items in a variety of formats here at the museum. We have materials that cover the scope of maritime history of the Champlain Valley from pre-contact through the present period. About 70% of these materials were recovered archaeologically by the museum or its predecessor groups, with the remaining 30% coming from private donations. An interesting point about this is that most of these collections are not actually owned by the museum, but are rather on repository to us from other organizations. So artifacts recovered from sites dating to the American Revolution on the lake, as well as military engagements from the French and Indian War and the War of 1812, are the property of the United States Navy and are managed by the museum on their behalf. And the artifacts that we have from the commercial era of the lake's history, from canal boat and steamboat sites primarily, are largely owned by the state of Vermont, and we manage those collections on their behalf as well.
Okay, so to revisit what others have talked about this afternoon, we'll quickly summarize our archaeology work at the museum. The museum was founded in 1985, and its predecessor organization, the Champlain Maritime Society, also had an archaeological focus. So essentially we have 40 plus years of archaeological collections, but also 40 plus years of field notes, associated research, conservation records, and institutional documentation about this work and all related museum projects. And many of these resources are being added to the GIS database you heard Taylor talk about earlier. And so a unique part of our structure at the museum is our conservation lab, where our artifacts are cared for after leaving their underwater environment and can serve for long-term preservation and exhibition, but we'll talk more about that later. We also conduct our own research projects here at the museum. Most recently, as we look towards the semi-quincentennial, the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution in 2026, we've been working at the site of Arnold's Bay, which is the final site of the Battle of Lake Champlain in October 1776. And we've talked at length about these excavations in previous versions of this conference, so please check out the recordings on our YouTube page if you're interested in learning more. We recovered approximately 800 artifacts from that excavation, many of which will eventually join the rest of the Navy's collection that are managed at the museum. We do more than our own research projects too here. As you heard Cher talk about earlier, the museum manages the Vermont Underwater Historic Preserve System on behalf of the Vermont Division for Historic Preservation. And as you heard Paul talk about, the archaeology team also does contract archaeology work, doing things like checking the area around where new power lines will be laid in the lake to ensure that no cultural resources are impacted by construction.
So with that amount of work going into all these archaeological projects, there have to be some problems and quirks with that system, and trust us, there are. First of all, archaeologists use numbering systems that differ from collections professionals, and the museum projects here have used different numbering systems over the years. So for example, some archaeological projects have used numbering systems based on artifact type. So O1 would reference metal and O2 would reference wood and so on, while others started their numbering system with the year that they were recovered. In that case, O1 would mean 2001. As a result, we occasionally have several objects with the same identifying number. And since these collections are largely repository collections, they don't have a museum accession number to differentiate them from one another. For those that aren't aware, an accession number is assigned to an object once it's been approved to be part of the museum's permanent collection and follows a strict structure across the field of information science, including identifying the year it was acquired at the beginning of the number. So in our case, the result is several different numbering systems for archaeologically recovered materials, and we needed to identify a database that could handle those differences while still producing coherent reports. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Another issue is the lack of context with some of these archaeological collections. So last week, Kelly and I did a presentation with the Collections Care and Conservation Alliance with the state archaeologist for Vermont, Jess Robinson. Jess was a co-panelist, and it was very validating to hear from his discussion that our collections largely meet the criteria mentioned for curation at the state, meaning that they were excavated by professional archaeologists in accordance with federal regulations. But not everything we have meets those criteria, which poses some issues. In archaeology, context is key. Knowing where you found an artifact in relationship to the artifacts around it is crucial to making any kind of analysis about that piece. And we don't always have that provenience for all the objects in our custody, especially if they were excavated by groups not affiliated with the museum. But when we do have it, we need to make sure that we keep that context associated with the rest of the documentation of the object. So that's another thing that was really important to us as we were looking for a new database. And then finally, like many other organizations, we have limited space to work with overall, so we have to keep that in mind as we make all collections management decisions.
Okay, so let's talk about opportunities. A few years ago, we were fortunate to receive some congressionally directed spending through Senator Leahy and the National Archives and Records Administration. This funding is giving us the ability to do what every institution dreams of, a comprehensive inventory of all of our collections and an ability to upgrade our collections management database at the same time. So we are so thrilled about this. And the goals of this project are twofold: to better organize our records internally so that we can share them externally. And this project is now underway, so the rest of the presentation is essentially us just talking about what we're doing.
Okay, so the first thing we had to do was develop good policies and protocols for working with these collections. We started by revising our collections management policy back in 2021 and updating our collections scope. So it's really important for any organization to have a clear plan for what they want to have in their collection, because while there's cool stuff everywhere, all museums can't keep all of it. So in our case, we're only keeping those materials that are directly related to the history and archaeology of the Champlain Valley. And putting that policy into place has helped with accepting new private donations so that we're making sure we're using our valuable space as efficiently as possible.
We also created an institutional records policy, which has been very helpful as we weed through and cull the last 40 years of record keeping at the museum. And there are a lot of records here. We are almost done with that process, and now it's certainly a lot easier to find both older records about museum projects, including our archaeological projects, and to respond to any research inquiries that people may have. And we also have a lot more space to deal with, which is incredibly helpful.
Great. So we mentioned a little earlier that we have a new collections management database that's called Catalog It, and we'll show you that on the back end in just a moment. As we've been transitioning data into that new database, we've been creating protocol documents, including a user manual and a protocol for controlled vocabulary or classifying our archaeological artifacts. We also have a photography protocol, and there's a photo of one of those templates here on the slide. All these protocol documents are living documents that our collections and archaeology teams review regularly and update as we learn more and get towards a more complete documentation of our collection. So for the moment, I'm going to stop sharing this presentation, and hopefully you'll be able to see the back end of our Catalog It page.
Field trip.
Okay, so this is what Catalog It looks like on the back end. And as you see, there's images of all of these different artifacts that are associated with the Valcour Bay Research Project. So just picking one, for example, this belt axe. When you click into it, you can see kind of the standard stuff that folks that might be familiar with these kinds of databases would expect. You've got your name, you've got your description, but then here we start to get into some really detailed information. And one of the things that's great about Catalog It is that you can be as generic or as specific as you want to be. So there's hundreds more fields than are visible right here. All you're looking at are just the ones that we've chosen to fill out, but I want to point out a few to you. So this lexicon field here is super helpful. Catalog It in particular has nomenclature 4.0, which is a museum classifying system just used to make sure museums across the field are using the same words to describe their objects. And nomenclature is just built directly into Catalog It, although you can certainly, there's lots of textbooks that describe all the content within it that you could use separately. And what you have here is this kind of neat little ellipses here. So if I click on it, I can see all the times that the word belt axe has been used in our collection, which is only one. It's kind of not surprising, but perhaps for some of the shells or cannonballs that we have on site, we'd have, several hundred of those in this record, which is great. I also talked a bit about the numbering system being an issue. And so one of the things we really appreciate about this database is the ability to distinguish multiple different number types. So here we just have one, the archaeological project number, but you can make as many different number types as needed. So if you have a loan number for an object, in addition to the archaeological number for the object, or maybe the accession number, they all appear here, but they're in different fields so that it doesn't mess up your reports when you're searching on them.
And this is really essential for the work that we do here. So it's just been a really wonderful tool. We've been able to put all these different numbering systems in and keep it concise, and we are able to figure out exactly what we need through that.
Great. We could talk at length about all these different entries here, but I just want to highlight a few other ones. This condition and conservation section is great. As I mentioned, we have an in-house conservation lab. And so here we're able to record information about each object's condition and conservation status, which is excellent. And then here in this relationships section, we have the ability to match objects with both people and places and events. So in this case, you can click here and see Valcour Bay, all the different objects in the collection that are related to Valcour Bay. So even if you have an object that wasn't recovered archaeologically, but that is associated with Valcour Bay, this gives you a chance to group all those things together. All right, I'm not going to talk about this in extreme detail, but that's just a quick overview of what we've got. All right, so moving on to storage.
Okay, so now that we've talked about our collections management system, let's just talk a little bit about some practical solutions for storage. Like I said earlier, we were fortunate enough through the NARA grant to get some funding, and so we've been able to purchase some brand new archival quality shelving unit, which, as you can see in the picture on the left, and when Paul was talking earlier, you could see some of those beautiful shelves that we have now that we're ready to use. However, you definitely don't need to have top of the line shelving in order to make your collections work for you. We've been storing our collections in boxes on wooden shelves for years, and through the practice of keeping like with like, which is just a standard collections management best practice, you'll be pretty good for long-term preservation. Another consideration is to keep objects separated based on their conservation level. So an example of that would be if you have a rusty cannonball next to a conserved cannonball, you would want to store them in separate boxes or in bags away from one another. Also, like I said, keeping artifacts stored in bags is a great way to keep objects away from one another while also keeping a lot of contextual information about them in an easily accessible format. So if you look at the picture on the right, we have all this wonderful information. I also want to note that the custom supports for the ceramic artifacts that you see in the middle there, we made those by cutting out little spaces or little nests in Ethafoam planks and adding those to trays that fit within the boxes. And these custom supports are going to be following the artifacts as they move from our wooden shelves onto our new metal shelving. And just a final note about storage and shelving is just to make sure that your cataloging system has a good method for tracking those artifacts. So for us, as we take them from one room to the other, we want to make sure that we know exactly where our things are at all times.
Okay, so when it comes to care, we're really fortunate to have a conservation lab in-house, and you've heard already from all of our archaeological staff who are trained in conservation. So this means that we can take steps to preserve items from a variety of formats when they're recovered from an underwater context before they're put into long-term storage. So here on the left is a photo of artifacts recovered from Arnold's Bay that are soaking in lake water-filled bags in a lake water-filled tank, so they stay stable as we prepare to take them through the conservation process. Now, conservation techniques will be different depending on where the artifacts are recovered from, so please reach out to professional conservators with questions about objects in your collection. But we're also happy to answer any questions you might have about caring for artifacts recovered from an underwater context in the Q&A, and if we run out of time, via email or phone.
Okay, so when it comes to use and access, we're always trying to find good ways to interpret our archaeological collections to the public. Most recently, that's taken form in the partnership with the Vermont State University Castleton and their excellent 3D imaging and printing lab. They've been working with us to scan some of our most interesting pieces and create 3D replicas of them, which is great for sharing with the public, both online and in person. And it gives us an opportunity to have people touch these artifacts. And in this slide, you can see our 2024 collections intern and Vermont State University student, Devin Cabral, showing the public how these scanners work at one of our programs in our new exhibit about underwater archaeology and canal boats. And speaking of public programs, we do a regular program called Collections Corner during our open season. It's an opportunity to take pieces that currently aren't on display or in exhibits out of our storage and into public view. And it's been a great way to keep getting these collections out in front of our visitors and inspire some really wonderful conversations. So I really recommend that you all come to one this season when we're open. And we're also open for researchers to come and view our collections and use them for projects. And usually this is through graduate underwater archaeology programs like Texas A&M, where our executive director, Chris, is an alum, and East Carolina University, ECU, where Taylor and Paul are alumni.
Okay. And when it comes to sharing our collections with researchers and the public, we're really proud to announce today that we've officially launched our Catalog It database online. So you can view it either through our collections page on our website or through the Catalog It Hub, which is a website managed by the company Catalog It, where you can browse the collections of any organizations that use this service. So today, the Valcour Bay Research Project collection is online for you to see now, and my colleagues are dropping the links to these pages in the chat. On either of these links, you can click on the image of the cannon next to the phrase Valcour Bay Research Project to access the full listing of artifacts. And over the course of 2025, we'll be posting more of our collection online, so please stay connected as we roll this out. And I think that's about it for our presentation today. We hope we've given you some ideas for ways you can apply this work to your own organizations, as well as some fun websites to check out. So thanks so much, and we'll transition to questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. That was great. We have a question about your collections management system from Susan. So, Patricia and Kelly, thank you. Did you recently migrate to catalog it from another collections management system? And if so, what did you have previously and how many records?
Ooh, Patricia, do you want to take that one?
That's a good question. Yes. So yes, we moved from a previous system, Past Perfect, we were using. We were not using the online version, rather the desktop version. And it was a pretty incomprehensive listing of all of our objects. But it was under 10,000 different lines that were in Past Perfect. As I mentioned, we were having kind of that issue with the numbering system, which made it a little bit hard to tease out that particular portion of the data. That's why it's great we have a chance to do kind of a comprehensive re-inventorying at this stage.
Great. And now that everyone is here and we're kind of finishing up our presentations, we're going to transition to our bigger Q&A. So if you have questions about this presentation or any of the earlier ones, feel free to keep asking them in the Q&A and we will try to get to all of you. So starting off with the ones who've been waiting the longest, David has a question for Taylor. David asks, have you had any interest or feedback from the VDHP about merging terrestrial site data along the edge of the lake to provide another contextual dimension?
Yeah, so the VDHP, the Vermont Department of Historic Preservation, we've been working with them with uploading sites to the Vermont Archaeology Inventory Online Resource Center. We've not talked with them about adding terrestrial site data, but I am interested in that, especially because those sites that are, you know, on the islands or they're on the edge of the lake exist in a very dynamic environment, and they can, and some of them already have, become submerged cultural sites, submerged archaeology sites, or have eroded into the lake. So it is absolutely important for us to map those in, and we are going to do that in the future as a wider part of the project, but not right now. You know, obviously there's a handful of sites such as the work that we've done in Arnold's Bay that will be getting added to it because it is that complex site where it is, you know, underwater and terrestrial. But in terms of strictly terrestrial sites, that will be kind of a little bit further down the line.
Great, thanks. And a question for Paul. Which agencies had jurisdiction over the compliance aspects of the Chippy project that you had talked about? It being a large interstate project, was it a federal entity? Was that process easy? How was that process?
Well, the project was really only in the state of New York. So in the state of New York, terrestrially and also underwater in the Lake Champlain portion. And then of course going into the Hudson and the Harlem River. There were a lot of lead agencies. I think the biggest agency is probably the United States Army Corps of Engineers for a lot of the permitting requirements that were needed initially when this project was actually starting off back in 2011, early 2000s. So you have United States Army Corps of Engineers. There are several departments in New York State at the state level. We have the New York Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, the Department of Environmental Conservation, and just any like oh no, Chris, I'm kind of blanking on the other New York agencies. If you can help me out there.
Sure. I mean, just about every New York state agency had some level of oversight over the environmental portion, the cultural resources, the energy transmission. So just about anybody you can think of in the New York state system, Department of Environmental Conservation, the SHPO's office, the New York State Museum, the Department of State, as well as the Office of General Services, all have some level of authority over submerged cultural resources in the Champlain Valley, at least. On the federal side, of course, the Department of Energy was involved. And as far as ease in working with those various agencies, thankfully, that wasn't up to us. That wasn't our part of the process. You know, we had to work closely with our project partners and contractors as they related specifically to the New York State SHPO's office and the New York State Museum. And that was, you know, for us to reach concurrence with them on our recommendations for avoidance or mitigation if that were to come up. So those are the agencies we worked most closely with through our contractors. You know, all of that higher level federal regulation and permitting was well above our pay grade, thankfully.
Great, thanks. Continuing down the list in order, we have Lynn asking, what is the current status of the Spitfire?
Sure. Yeah, obviously the Spitfire wasn't a focus of today's presentations, but I'm happy to give you a brief update on that. We are currently in the second year of a project with the American Battlefield Protection Program, which is a National Park Service grant funding agency, to create a research design for future archaeological work on the Spitfire site. For those of you not familiar, the Spitfire is the last fully intact war vessel from the American Revolution in Lake Champlain. And it rests in deep water on the New York side of the lake, where it sank during the retreat from the Battle of Valcour Island. So we've, as part of this grant-funded project, we've assembled a Spitfire Advisory Council of other cultural heritage organizations in the Champlain Valley, other archaeological experts, partners within both New York and Vermont states' historic preservation offices, the New York State Museum, of course, the U.S. Navy, who's involved, who are all providing input in creating this research design and helping us, you know, define both the questions that we want to answer by looking archaeologically at the Spitfire and the methodologies that we would employ to answer those questions. So that's a process that's ongoing at the moment. We're narrowing in on finalizing that research design, which will include some archaeological in-person archaeological investigation of the site in 2026. At this point, I can't really release much more detail than that, but it is an ongoing project and one we're really excited to spend some time in the water researching in the relatively near future.
Thanks, Chris. We have an attendee asking another question about Chippy, saying there must be a great number of cables or pipes that are perpendicular to the high voltage cable, and how are these intersections handled?
It's a very good question. Yeah, there are many cables, there are many pipes. I think just as a little teaser, one of the most interesting cables that was identified was a link to Cold War era missile silos that was no longer being used here in the region that has since been deactivated. But you know, we were concerned about other infrastructure and including active infrastructure. So what the Chippy engineers and the other team members have done is for sensitive areas like that, they have this I don't have a picture, but you can look it up online. It's called a concrete mattress, specifically an articulated concrete mattress. And what this is it's a system of concrete panels that are set on a mattress that can move, it can flex. And what happens is they put this down and it gently rests on top of any infrastructure, any cable or what have you. And then they're able to lay the Chippy line right on top of it. I don't know if any of our Chippy folks are online with us today who can maybe put some more information about that into the chat. But if you do, go to the Champlain Hudson Power Express website. You can learn more information about that.
Great, thanks, Paul. And continuing on the Chippy questions, Chippy is popular today. Tom is asking, can you speak to the procurement process for securing the contract for Chippy? How does that kind of work?
Yeah, I can talk about that. So for contracting, what contractors will do if they are looking for work that requires any archaeological compliance, so anything that has to do with Section 106, the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 112, if there is the potential of impacting whether it's a terrestrial site or an underwater archaeological site, they need to look for people who can do the work. And what that entails in the beginning is a request for proposal or an RFP. And what a client or contractor will do is they'll send out this RFP request to known cultural resource management firms, whether they're terrestrial or underwater. What those firms will do is they will answer specific questions, like say, okay, the RFP says that you have to do X work, have Y results, and then Z, X, other amounts of work. And so those contractors can say, like, yes, we can do X, yes, we can do Y, yes, we can do Z. This is our budget. And so they'll bid on a project. And depending on the bid amount, if that falls in line with the budget of the client, then the client, also the expertise of the firm. So if the bid, the money, the capabilities, and the expertise of any cultural resource management firm lines up with what a client is looking for, then they will award that proposal, that contract to the cultural resource management firm. What we've had to do is we've had to put in not RFPs exactly, but proposals, at least, I don't know, 8, 10 different proposals that we've worked on so far for different parts of this project, outline the work, outline our capabilities, outlining what the project is, outlining what our deliverables are going to be, a timeline, and basically create a budget to go with that proposal. And then once our client, which was TRC in this case, was able to look at that, they say, yes, like they can do this. Yes, we're happy with that. And so that's more or less how the process has gone with us and how the process goes in general. Chris or Cher, if you wanted to add in, or Taylor, anything else, by all means, please.
I think that covers it pretty well. In this case, we had started on the project back in the early 2000s in its first iteration. Luckily, so when the project was temporarily paused and then revived, in the early 2020s, I guess, 2019 to some extent. They came right back to us because we had done the preliminary first phase 1 assessment of the original Chippy line. And so, we luckily had already gone through that procurement process. They came back to us with new tasks and asked for proposals for those. We were able to supply them and then conduct this work. So we were
And I
kind of
guess we can
grandfathered
add
into this
too,
one.
I mean, every year archaeologists have to go through a state training, to be a part of that, to stay on the contract list. So we're generally contracted for these kinds of requests for proposals from people that need work done. And we pick through and see what we can actually do in a year, and generally stick to more underwater rather than terrestrial projects, though. A lot of us do have background in terrestrial, so maybe that's something that we could move into someday. But we generally like to stick to our expertise and where we have our data management systems, and that's underwater.
Yeah, and that's true. I would say also in the projects we select, we tend to stay in our lane. We like to work in the corridors that we know best, right?
Yeah, that's a good way to put
we're
it.
Lake Champlain people, so we're gonna work on connected waterways to Lake Champlain. And that's, I don't see our team traveling off to look at oil pipelines in Alabama or Mississippi or Louisiana. We want to focus on the areas that we have some expertise in, and that is Lake Champlain, the Hudson River Corridor, New York City Harbor, the Erie Canal System and its associated Finger Lakes, to some extent the Great Lakes. But we don't really need to move far beyond that. One of the real challenges of this museum is finding the right balance between doing contract work and doing our own research work, and making sure that both of them are as mission focused as possible for the organization.
Great, thanks, guys. Question for everyone here. Zach asks, what's in store for this year's field season?
That is a good question.
Well, generally speaking, just to hit this first, I mean, as I was mentioning in the first presentation, we try to make the rounds to as many dive preserve sites as we can, and looking overall at the other projects that we have to do, we fit those in as appropriate. I mean, there's a lot of sites too that sometimes can be washed out at certain times of the year. Something like the Water Witch, for example, you're not going to that early. It's generally washed out by the outer creek. And so, sometimes you'll try and go, and then you'll have to make separate trips to keep trying to figure that out. So that's always on our list. We're generally trying to do a regular rotation to those and get to as many as we can. And then, I don't know, you guys want to speak to some of the others?
Yeah, we hope to be doing some additional work on the Phoenix site, which Cher also touched base with. Again, working with CODA. We hope to complete a photogrammetry model, a scaled georeference photogrammetry model of the main portion of the Phoenix Hall this summer. So that was also the plan for last summer, and we only managed to capture a fragment of it. Weather was not super cooperative. So that's a big project. Certainly looking at the preserve sites. As Taylor mentioned, we have less than ideal locational data for some of the shipwrecks that are included in the amazing geo database that Taylor's been assembling for us. So we will be going out and visiting many of those sites and refining our locational data, ideally capturing at least a bow and a stern for many of those sites, so we can actually orient this target in our overall database. And right now we often just have a point that's vaguely in the middle of the shipwreck. So it'd be good to have more refined data for many of those. Other than that, we have a number of options of other things that may percolate along. We're hoping to do a lot of photogrammetry, though. That's one of my big goals.
Yeah, I think as Chris was saying, we have plans to get in, do some more photogrammetry of the dive preserve wrecks, because they haven't all got like a real nice high quality model yet. Some of them just have a very I don't want to say rudimentary model, but it's something that gives us a good idea of what's going on at the site, but isn't that high scientific value model that that Cher was talking about. So we are planning on doing some of those. We are nominating one of the preserves, the Providence Island wreck, to the National Register. So we're going to be collecting some data on that, and just kind of achieving those sort of tasks this year. We also are probably going to be supporting some of our partners, like Chris was saying, CODA, and also potentially Texas A&M when they come out this year. And that's sort of and we're ramping up for bigger work on projects like Spitfire or going back to Arnold's Bay.
Yeah, and I will take the opportunity here to say that Taylor just touched on an important component here, that a lot of what I see the role of the Maritime Museum is of course conducting our own research operations, but also facilitating other people to come and do good work in Lake Champlain. We have an abundance of resources. We have an endless supply of thesis or dissertation topics. For any of you nautical or maritime studies people out there in the world that are looking for work to do, please consider talking to us about what we have right at our fingertips, relatively easily accessible logistically, and we'd love to find ways to partner with other folks to come do good work here in Lake Champlain.
And to wrap it all up, The other things that we might be doing, well, definitely doing is archaeological monitoring for Chippy and any other associated field work with that.
Lots going on. All right. Switching gears a little bit, Ralph asks, what reference resources are available at the museum to aid in identifying newly discovered objects?
That's an interesting question. There's obviously plenty of, it totally depends on what type of object we're talking about here. A lot of it is based just on our own knowledge and our understanding of what we found in the past. So that's certainly helpful by looking through all of our previous project reports and documentation, and the sources that we gathered information from those for are helpful for us in identifying objects that we can't discover. We also, I'm not gonna lie, we lean heavily on our other museums and institutions in the area that have expertise in some of these areas. You know, in particular, when we had lots of little pieces of muskets and firearms from the American Revolution, we talked to our amazing colleagues at Fort Ticonderoga Museum, who were able to identify, you know, even the smallest fragment of a lock plate from a musket down to, you know, a couple of good examples from their collection of different year patterns that were created. So, you know, the whole variety of resources. There's these days, there's also really excellent online resources when it comes to trying to identify and date things like pottery, even glass and bottles. You know, there's a lot of great online resources for that information. So really depends on what kind of object we're talking about. We have our own research library here as well of, you know, archaeological reports and informational text about all variety of shipwreck sites from around the world that we can use as reference. So there's plenty of options.
Great. All right. Addison asks, are there any plans to create photogrammetric models of Congress, Allen, or any of the other galleys located in the lake from the Revolutionary War or the War of 1812?
Sure, I'll jump on that one real quick too. For Congress, you know, Congress is the row galley was Benedict Arnold's flagship during the Battle of Valcour Island and was burned and abandoned in Arnold's Bay. You may have heard us talking about that in previous virtual archaeology conferences. In 2023, we had the opportunity to excavate a good portion of the stern bow. No, I'm sorry, the starboard bow of the remains of that vessel, and we're able to determine that there's probably a good portion of the port side of the bow there as well that has yet to be excavated. We do have a photogrammetry model of the structure that we were able to uncover. It's not something that we've shared widely yet, but feel free to reach out to me directly and I can share that with you. It is just a fragment, so it's not a hugely helpful as far as design or overall shape of the vessel, but it's a good indicator of what we're looking at. Specifically the Allen, which is a row galley that dates to the American row galley from the War of 1812. It's one that it's located down in the Poultney River at the very extreme southern end of Lake Champlain near Whitehall, New York. It's one that I'd love to get back and see what condition it's in, but it is in the Poultney River, which has notoriously terrible visibility year-round at all times. So I don't think photogrammetry is really an option in this case for that specific vessel. There is an excellent thesis written on that vessel from when it was documented in the mid-1990s by Eric Emery that I could certainly give you a reference to if you don't have it already. But I would like to get back there, possibly in the future with mechanical scanning sonar to create, you know, a record of what its current status is. But that's a future hope and dream for field work. So other than that, those are the only two row galleys that we have any information about other than the Washington, which we have a lines drawing from. The Washington was captured by the British during its retreat from Valcour. And they took a nice lines drawing off of it when they converted it to a brig, I think, from from the Latine rig that it had originally. And that lines drawing, which is an 18th century lines drawing, has been very helpful in helping us determine what we're looking at in Congress, which is presumably a very similarly shaped and sized vessel to Washington. So
and
those are
I encourage you to check out some of our other our past archaeology conference presentations that are recorded on our YouTube channel, because we've covered a lot of that, and you can see some of the stills at the very least for those photogrammetry models. Those aren't public on our Sketchfab, but you can at least see some of the stills of some of that work if you're interested.
All right, we've got a couple more chippy questions here. So Ned asks, how far south are they currently in their progress laying the cable?
That's actually a good question. I'm not exactly sure how far south they are. I know that because of seasonal restrictions, they had to stop work in Lake Champlain. And with other not only seasonal restrictions, but also environmental restrictions for the Hudson River. The work has started, it's gone on for a couple of days in the past year, really towards the end, almost right through Christmas. And then it stopped, then it was able to start again. It's really dependent upon permitting, going through there without any restricted seasons or other things that they can't do. But I would say if you go online and look at the Chippy website, or just even Google Champlain Hudson Power Express, you will find their main website. You will find their Twitter, now X handle as well. I don't know if they do any updates on Facebook, but you can probably track their progress like that. Or your local newspaper if you live in the area of the Hudson River.
Yeah, and I believe that at least in Lake Champlain, they got about half of the cable, starting at the Canadian border, they got about halfway down. And in the Hudson River, they may have made even more progress. But it is interesting to me that they're laying both these lines at the same time. They're obviously, it's not one continuous line that runs the whole way down. It will become that eventually. And I do believe that the terrestrial portion that's going to connect the Lake Champlain portion to the Hudson River portion has already been laid as well, though I'm not 100% sure about that.
Okay.
So there's still more to be done, but they did make pretty decent progress in 2024.
Great. And relatedly, someone is saying in the chat, archaeologist here, digging continues on Chippy between Whitehall and Rockland County. Cable isn't laid in these areas just yet.
Gotcha.
So that
Thanks for that
sounds like
update.
an update. All right. Relatedly, Tom has a couple of questions about Chippy and cultural resource management. So first of all, do you have to compete with other potential providers of cultural resource management work? And secondly, do you ever engage private vessels for your research and survey work?
So in answer to the first question, yes, there's always the potential possibility that we're in competition with other firms. Thankfully, because we have a track record already in working with Chippy back in 2009, going till 2012, I believe, Chris. We were able to be reapproached to do work on the other survey work and CRM work with them. And then for engaging private research vessels, maybe you can talk a little bit about this, Chris. Like, we have worked with previous employees here at the museum, previous dive masters who have used their own vessels, but not for a whole lot of work, really just as kind of a staging platform for one of our metal detecting surveys. But
Yeah.
all the other work that has been done by OSI or another survey company.
Yeah, specifically for the Chippy, we don't have much of an opportunity to utilize any private vessels. That's again all takes place above our pay grade. We get to luckily work with the amazing data that they produce, and that makes our work a hell of a lot easier. For other contract projects in general, there's certainly the possibility. We do, as Paul mentioned, some work down in New York Harbor on a bid team with for projects that are coming out of the Army Corps of Engineers in New York Harbor. And there we work with a team of folks, who when we have remote sensing specialists. We have our geomorphology experts. So those, we're working with independent private vessels for those, but we're not the ones that are directly contracting them or hiring them. We have also partnered with local research private vessels, and specifically this is mostly with the RV Folger. That was a Middlebury College research vessel from their geology department, which had multi-beam capability that has provided just incredible data for us in the past on some projects. But that's about the extent of it to this point.
Another question related to Paul's presentation, but this can be for everyone. Oliver asks about the redacted wrecks in the presentation. What's the reason for redacting the location of certain shipwrecks?
Taylor or Cher, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I could jump in and talk about that. Yeah, so by law, archaeological resources are is classified, so we can't share that information with the public. And so, for example, for my presentation, you saw the map that was at the start of my presentation, which is known as a Firefly map, and it was used for our advertisement for the conference and things like that, which is more a density representation map. You know, it's not really meant for you know, trying to find the specific locations. And then there was my map where I had the points about the preserves. The preserve wrecks are a special class. You know, they've been conserved, and they're in a way, and they're now open for the public to go visit, which is part of what helps, you know, create a really unique diving community here in Lake Champlain to, you know, instill this sense of, you know, preservation, curation, monitoring, you know, in the diving community, you know, and these preserve site systems, when they're there, you know, it really does instill that value in those communities. So so that's why, you know, I would then create this, you know, that second map where I could show that, and then I could include that data, because that data has effectively been declassified.
Right. So so states, these are state sites, like state archaeological sites. And because the preserve system, you know, has this accessibility feature that protects them from anchor dropping, like that's why these are the known sites, right? Like these are the safer ones to visit. But yeah, I think, Chris, do you want to add anything
Well,
to that? I'm
that's
not sure
right. I
exactly
mean,
the reference of what was redacted where, but
yeah, these resources belong to the states whose waters they're sunk in, so they get to tell us what we can make public or not. And that's true of land sites too, right? Terrestrial sites are also, you know, typically made accessible to other researchers and archaeologists, but you have to go through a vetting process before you gain access to locational information for those sites.
right. And I was speaking a little bit about the state GIS, and how some of the data on there is private, some of it's public. So, you know, anyone can access this state GIS. You're not going to be able to see the same thing that registered archaeologists will. And that's just the nature of you know, the protection of the archaeological sites. Every state does this.
Yep.
Great. And then Michael asks, with the 250th of Valcour coming up, are there any plans to get back to exploring the bottom of the bay?
I'd love to get back to the bay. This was grant funded research, you know, so looking to that, you know, we have general plans in the future to go back and, you know, we've laid out quite a lot of questions that we have for that site. So yes, but no solid plans yet. We're still planning and continuing on. We have some ongoing grants for other sites right now, as we previously mentioned. Chris, I don't know if you want to add anything to that as well.
Yeah. For, you know, for Valcour Bay itself, we don't have any specific plans for returning at this point. There's still plenty of work to be done at Valcour. We have been collaborating with a team from Texas A&M University who is looking at and is coming back in 2025 to do some additional work in Valcour. specifically at the site where the gunboat Philadelphia was sunk and then recovered from. This Texas A&M is also involved in the reconservation of the gunboat Philadelphia that is on display in the National Museum of American History down in Washington, D.C. in the Smithsonian system. As part of that larger conservation project between the Smithsonian and Texas A&M, they are curious about whether there are other components of the Philadelphia that might still be present on the bottom of Valcour that weren't recovered in 1935 when that boat was raised. So they're going to be conducting some archaeological work in that area for a second year to see if they can find any lost components from the Philadelphia. Other than that, lots of historic research going on around the Battle of Valcour Island and the days after, of course. But I would love in the future to get back and do some more systematic work in Valcour. We recovered
And Arnold's Bay too.
and in Arnold's Bay, of course. I think that the quick look at the collections that Patricia and Kelly gave us, which was all about the Valcour Bay Research Project in this case, that slice of the collections really demonstrates both the quantity and quality of the artifacts and their preservation at the bottom of Valcour Bay. So love to get back there, but no immediate plans other than this work with Texas A&M.
Right, and kind of relatedly to continued research, Sam asks, are there any historically known vessels lost in the lake that are yet to be found, that are highly sought after by the museum to be found or identified due to their historical or archaeological significance?
That's a great question. Yes.
I
I think we've found the majority of them. Taylor, you sound like you got something.
Yeah, I mean, I have a soft spot for the whole smuggling piracy topics. So Black Snake, of the Black Snake affair is one in my heart that I would love to figure out what's happened to it.
A
In
rum runner.
terms,
It'd be fun to find a rum runner from Prohibition
yeah,
era.
yeah.
Supposedly they were running a large amount of alcohol across the border in boats and occasionally having to sink their boats.
Yeah, exactly. But then also, I mean, there's still a lot of wrecks in the lake that we have questions about, right? So the U.S. Army Air Force crash boat that's in the lake by Valcour, Wreck E, if you want to look into it on our website. We still have a lot of questions about that. So there's a lot of, wrecks in the lake that we need to answer. But other than that, I can't think of any.
Yeah, the other ones that I'm really interested to see more about, of course, the Congress we just talked about is a current obsession of mine. But also some of the French and Indian War related wrecks that are down near Fort Ticonderoga, which includes, the British sloop the Boscawen, which has been excavated and documented pretty well, but could use some additional work. There's also the potential for a French sloop nearby there, which we've never looked at a French-made vessel in Lake Champlain up to this point. And there's a portion of a radeau there as well, which radeau is a really strange vessel type from this region that is basically a floating gun battery. It's a gun barge, you might call it. And while we have an example of a fully intact one from the Lake George region, that's a British-built radeau. The radeau near Fort Ticonderoga is a French-built one, and we really have no idea what it looks like. So I would be really interested to do some work on that vessel. But other than that, one of the enduring mysteries of Lake Champlain for the last 50 years has been this plane crash that Taylor mentioned during their presentation. That was a plane that crashed in 1971 and was just relocated in 2024. And that's a plane crash, which I believe 5 people were lost on that plane crash. It crashed in early December of 1971, and almost immediately the lake iced over. And while a few pieces of wreckage did wash up on shore, they were unable to locate this plane, and like I said, until last summer. This is another project that Gary Lefebvre had a large hand in and did some just amazing work on. So it was really fantastic to finally have that mystery solved and to bring some closure to the families who were still, at loose ends as to what happened to their family members. Other than that, there's not many other specifically named vessels that we haven't been able to at least some information on. We have too many vessels that we don't know the name of that we would like to find out the name of. Like the Providence Island Canal Sloop, this beautifully preserved.
Right. There's
canal
still
boat.
so much research to do on what we kind of barely know. And, you know, cleaning up some of the data in the GIS, like Taylor had been talking about, you know, truthing some of these sonar targets again after many years. I mean, this is a huge data set that we manage, and you know, we're excited always to get in the water and add to that that data set. So
Absolutely, there's lots more to be done.
Great. And then we have another person who has a question. You guys do a lot of work with Texas A&M. Are there other universities that you partner with?
Yes, there are. I mean, so the two principal schools that we do work with are Texas A&M University, because they have a nautical archaeology program. Also, I'm an alumni from that program. Kevin Chrisman, who's one of the faculty members there, is a Vermont native and one of the people that started doing archaeology in Lake Champlain in the 80s and 90s. So we have a strong connection with Texas A&M. As I think Sarah mentioned when we were opening up this process, you know, Taylor and Paul are both graduates from the East Carolina Maritime Studies program. So we're expanding our collaborative efforts with them, with students of that program, I should say, and very happy to do that. We also do some really interesting and fun 3D modeling work right now with Vermont State University's Castleton campus, who has a special program in 3D imaging. Now they're dealing mostly with the 3D scanning of objects and to some extent structures, I believe. But we've been incorporating them and their work into our collections management. We're getting some of our folks trained up on how to do that 3D imaging. We're supplying information to them about photogrammetry, and so there's a good exchange of information there. We do have some overlap with the University of Vermont and Middlebury College, a couple of our regional universities here that are great to work with. Am I missing anybody?
That pilot program with Champlain College too, as I had mentioned. We're trying to fundraise for that now.
Yeah,
but
Champlain
we're open
College is
to
good.
always partnering with new universities. There's so much work that we can do here. Send us your grad students.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, there's just not that many university programs that are specifically geared towards underwater archaeology, which is why we tend to congregate around Texas A&M and East Carolina University for that kind of work at this point.
All right, question about 3D modeling. James says, recently saw a new 3D technique used on the Endeavor that uses laser measurements combined with photos to render a 3D model with details to 1 millimeter. Are you familiar with this? Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's you know, the work they did on the Endeavor is absolutely on another level from what we're able to achieve at this point, just because the funding there is extraordinary. You know, we're often all of our 3D modeling is either captured through you know, handheld diver cameras when we're in water taking thousands of photographs, or by mounting cameras on ROVs. And in this case, we're using relatively low cost underwater drones. So this is you know, again, a whole different class of vessel from the multiple $100,000 ROVs that they were using on projects like the Endeavor. So the way that we, you know, it's incredible technology to use the lasers to be able to scale those 3D models. We do it typically in a more analog way, I guess I'd say that. By including scale bars or things of known measurement within the photogrammetry model, we can then go into the model in the computer and tell it, you know, here's a yardstick that we left on the bottom of the lake. It's exactly 3 feet long, and then it will constrain the model to those dimensions. That then allows us to go and take measurements off of other components of the vessel and have some confidence that those are fairly accurate measurements. So that's the way we deal with that, is by incorporating scale bars into our photogrammetry modeling efforts.
Thanks, Chris. And it looks like we're coming to the end of our questions here. If you guys think of any other questions that you'd like to ask, please feel free to reach out to us via email or give us a call or get in touch with us, and we'd love to chat more about this. But otherwise, I think we can wrap up our conference for today. So thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for all of your great questions. We're so thrilled to get to talk to you guys. And of course, thank you to all of our presenters for sharing your work. It was great to hear about. And again, we'd especially like to thank our members who make this work possible. And if you want to learn more about becoming a member, you can visit the link posted in the chat and learn more about that. So thank you all so much for joining us today, and have a good night.
We'll see you next year. Thank you,
Thanks all.
everybody.
Thank you.
Mhm.